I almost lost my life in Salem. My name is Thaddeus James Blackwood, 34 years old, born and raised in the concrete jungle of Chicago. I never thought I'd find myself running for my life through the dark woods of Massachusetts. But that's exactly what happened last October. The irony wasn't lost on me. A city boy with an accounting degree and an allergy to poison ivy somehow ended up in a nightmare that most horror novels couldn't compete with. The whole disaster started with what was supposed to be a soul-searching road trip after my divorce. My therapist called it exposure therapy for my anxieties. I called it torture. Still, after Melanie left, taking the apartment and half my sanity with her, I figured a change of scenery couldn't make things worse. I borrowed my brother's Toyota RAV4, packed enough supplies to survive comfortably for a couple weeks, and set off eastward with no real destination in mind. Just me, the open road, and a playlist full of songs that didn't remind me of her. Massachusetts wasn't even on my original itinerary, but a chance conversation at a diner in upstate New York with a bearded stranger who called himself a folkloric enthusiast changed everything. He spoke of Salem's lesser-known camping spots, hidden gems where the veil between worlds was supposedly thinner during autumn. I'd always scoffed at supernatural nonsense. Ghosts, witches, demons, all bedtime stories for the gullible. But something in his eyes when he talked about the whispers in the woods near Gallows Hill made my skin crawl in a strangely exhilarating way. 3 days later, I found myself driving through Salem's historic district, surrounded by quaint colonial architecture and tacky witch-themed tourist traps. The town had a palpable energy that even a skeptic like me couldn't deny, a heaviness in the air that seemed to press against my chest. I spent the first day exploring, visiting the Salem Witch Museum, and strolling through the old burial grounds where weathered headstones leaned at odd angles, as if the dead beneath were shifting uncomfortably. That night, I stayed at a small bed and breakfast run by an elderly woman named Mrs. Putnam, who seemed oddly concerned when I mentioned my camping plans. "The forests around here aren't like Chicago parks, Mr. Blackwood," she cautioned, her wrinkled hands trembling slightly as she handed me my room key. "They remember things the rest of us try to forget." I laughed it off, thanked her for the warning, and blamed her ominous tone on the town's commitment to its spooky brand. Tourism dollars, right? The next morning, I stocked up on supplies at a local outdoor store where the clerk, a tattooed woman with silver hair despite her young face, offered me a small cloth bag of herbs for protection. I accepted it with a polite smile, tossing it into my glove compartment and promptly forgetting about it. If I'd known then what I know now, I would have sewn that bag into my jacket and bathed in its contents. Funny how the things you dismiss as superstitious nonsense can become your most desperate hope when reality starts to unravel. By mid-afternoon, I had driven the RAV4 along increasingly narrow roads until pavement gave way to dirt and gravel. My GPS signal weakened, then disappeared entirely as dense trees formed a canopy overhead, blocking out most of the sunlight. The campsite the bearded stranger had marked on my map was supposed to be just ahead, a secluded clearing near a small lake, perfect for someone wanting solitude. What I didn't realize was that in Salem's woods, being alone was the last thing any sane person should want. I found the clearing just as dusk began to settle, the dying light casting long shadows across what would become my home for the next 3 days, or so I thought. As I set up my tent and built a small fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were watching me from between the trees. A disturbing sensation like fingers tracing my spine made me whirl around more than once, only to find nothing but darkness gathering at the forest's edge. Just nerves, I told myself, poking at the fire with a stick. Just a city boy jumping at shadows. If only it had been something as innocent as shadows. That first night in the woods near Salem passed uneventfully. Though my sleep was fitful and filled with dreams I couldn't quite remember upon waking. Just vague impressions of whispers and movement at the edge of my consciousness. Morning brought a thick fog that clung to the ground and wrapped around the tree trunks like ghostly fingers. The lake I'd camped near was completely obscured, though I could hear water lapping gently at its shores somewhere beyond the wall of mist. I spent the day hiking around the area, mapping my surroundings and taking photos of the unusual rock formations that dotted the landscape. Some appeared almost like crude altars, flat-topped stones arranged in rough circles. Probably natural, I muttered to myself, though the precision of their placement made something in my gut tighten uncomfortably. As I wandered farther from camp, I noticed strange markings carved into several trees, symbols that looked like a cross between ancient runes and the scribbles of a disturbed mind. Fresh, too. The exposed wood hadn't darkened with age. By midday, my phone had died despite being fully charged that morning. The battery had drained completely in just a few hours, something that had never happened before. The compass I'd brought as a backup was spinning erratically, the needle swinging wildly before settling on a direction, then changing its mind seconds later. I should have recognized these as warning signs, should have packed up and left immediately. Instead, I convinced myself there must be deposits of iron or some other mineral affecting the electronics and magnetic field. A rational explanation for an irrational situation, the last refuge of a mind unprepared for the truth. As afternoon stretched toward evening, I noticed the wildlife had gone eerily silent. No birdsong, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, just the sound of my own breathing and the occasional creak of branches shifting in the wind. Even the insects seemed to have abandoned the area. The silence was oppressive, pressing against my eardrums like cotton wool. That's when I found the doll, a crude thing made of twisted twigs and what looked disturbingly like human hair, hanging from a low branch just at the edge of my clearing. It twisted slowly in the breeze, seemingly watching me with its featureless twig face. I took it down, telling myself it was probably left by teenagers trying to scare campers, or maybe part of some neo-pagan ritual that was harmless if somewhat creepy. As I held it, a sharp pain shot through my palm. A splinter, I thought, but when I examined my hand, I found a perfect, bloodless puncture mark that went straight through my palm. Clean, like something had deliberately pierced me. The pain faded almost immediately, replaced by a cold numbness that slowly crept up my arm. That night, I couldn't get warm no matter how high I built the fire. In retrospect, I should have left right then. But something was affecting my thinking, a strange lethargy coupled with an inexplicable reluctance to leave the campsite. Every time I thought about packing up, my mind would wander, and I'd find myself staring into the fire or at the tree line, minutes or sometimes hours lost in a trance I couldn't explain. It was as if the forest wanted me there, had plans for me. I know how that sounds. Believe me, I do. I was the biggest skeptic, the guy who rolled his eyes at ghost stories and scoffed at superstition. Now I'm the one telling tales that sound unhinged. That second night, I awoke to whispering. Not the wind in the trees or the rustle of leaves, but actual voices, dozens of them, speaking in hushed tones just beyond my tent. The language wasn't English or any other tongue I could identify. The syllables seemed to slither rather than flow, with harsh clicks and sounds no human throat should produce. I lay paralyzed in my sleeping bag, sweat beading on my forehead despite the autumn chill, as something scraped against the outside of my tent. Not the random brushing of branches, but deliberate, exploratory touches. When I finally gathered the courage to unzip the tent and look outside, the clearing was empty, but the ground around my campsite was covered in footprints. Small, like a child's, but with too many toes, the impressions unnaturally deep as if whatever made them carried impossible weight. I didn't sleep again that night. As dawn broke, I noticed a circle of mushrooms had sprouted around my tent overnight, a perfect ring of pale, spotted fungi that hadn't been there when I turned in. Mrs. Putnam's warnings echoed in my head, along with snippets of New England folklore I'd picked up at the Salem museums. Witch circles, fairy rings, boundaries between worlds. I'd laughed at those stories just days earlier. Now, as I cautiously stepped over the ring to retrieve firewood, the sky seemed to flicker momentarily, like reality itself was an old television losing signal. For a split second, I saw the same forest, but wrong. The trees were twisted into impossible shapes, and the sky was a color I cannot describe, a hue that shouldn't exist. Then it was gone, everything normal again except for the hammering of my heart and the certainty that I needed to leave. Now, I packed in a frenzy, throwing gear haphazardly into my backpack, not bothering to fold my tent properly. My hands trembled as I worked, and not just from the unnatural chill that had settled over the campsite. The silence had deepened, if that was even possible, a vacuum of sound that made my ears ring. Even the perpetual rustling of leaves had stopped, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, watching me. The fog had returned, thicker than before, curling around my ankles like spectral hands trying to hold me in place. As I tossed the last of my supplies into the RAV4, I noticed something dark smeared across the driver's side window, a crude drawing in what looked disturbingly like dried blood. It depicted a hunched figure with elongated limbs being pursued by what I can only describe as a swarm. My throat closed up as I wiped it away with shaking hands, leaving rusty streaks across the glass. The substance crumbled like dried clay, but the metallic smell that clung to my fingers was unmistakable. I retched, spitting bile onto the forest floor as panic tightened its grip on my chest. The engine wouldn't start. Of course it wouldn't. That would have been too easy, too merciful. I turned the key again and again, listening to the dying wheeze of the starter motor as the battery rapidly drained. When I popped the hood, the cause became sickeningly clear. The engine compartment was filled with those same pale mushrooms, their caps glistening with moisture, their stems woven through the machinery like invasive roots. They had grown completely through the engine block, impossibly penetrating solid metal. Some part of my mind, the part still desperately clinging to rationality, insisted this couldn't happen. Fungus doesn't grow through steel overnight. But there it was, my escape literally devoured by the forest. I grabbed my emergency pack, the one with essentials I kept separate from my main gear: water purification tablets, protein bars, a compass, flashlight, and knife. The weight of it against my back was the only comforting thing in this nightmare. My plan was simple: follow the dirt road back to the main highway. It couldn't be more than 5 or 6 miles. Even with the fog, even with my compromised compass, I could follow the road. Simple, straightforward, possible. I kept repeating those words like a mantra as I set off, the crunch of gravel under my boots absurdly loud in the unnatural quiet. I'd been walking for what felt like hours, but couldn't have been more than 45 minutes when I realized something was very wrong. The road should have started to widen, should have shown signs of approaching civilization. Instead, it was narrowing, the gravel giving way to bare earth, then to what was little more than a game trail winding between increasingly dense trees. Worse, the terrain was unfamiliar. I was seeing rock formations and landmarks I hadn't passed on my way in. Somehow, impossibly, I was going deeper into the forest, not out of it. The realization hit me like a physical blow, driving the air from my lungs. I was lost, being led astray by a forest that seemed determined to keep me. That's when I heard the singing, a high, childlike voice somewhere in the distance, the melody hauntingly familiar though I couldn't place it. The rational part of my brain, the part still fighting against the encroaching horror, suggested it might be another camper or a local kid, someone who could help me. The rest of me, the primitive hindbrain now fully engaged in survival mode, recognized the sound for what it was: bait, a lure. I stood frozen on the trail, torn between the desperate hope for human contact and the growing certainty that whatever was singing wasn't human at all. Night was falling again, the darkness beneath the trees deepening from gray to pitch black with alarming speed. My flashlight beam seemed feeble against the encroaching shadows, barely penetrating a few feet ahead. The singing had stopped, replaced by what sounded like sobbing, heart-wrenching, desperate crying that tugged at something primal in my chest. Despite every instinct screaming at me to run in the opposite direction, I found myself moving toward the sound. Someone was in trouble. Someone needed help. These thoughts pushed me forward even as cold sweat ran down my back. I broke through a tangle of underbrush into a small clearing and felt my heart stutter in my chest. In the center stood a child, a little girl in a white dress that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. Her back was to me, her dark hair hanging in wet tangles down her small frame. The sobbing was coming from her, her thin shoulders shaking with each gasping breath. "Are you okay?" I called out, my voice sounding strange and muffled in the dense air. "Are you lost?" The question seemed absurd as soon as I'd asked it. Of course she was lost. We both were. The sobbing stopped abruptly. The little girl went completely still, unnaturally so, not even appearing to breathe. Then, with a movement too fluid to be natural, she began to turn toward me. I raised my flashlight, the beam catching her profile as she rotated, and felt the scream build in my throat before it ever reached my lips. What faced me wasn't a child at all. The features were wrong, stretched and distorted like a reflection in a funhouse mirror. The eyes were too large, too round, with pupils that expanded and contracted like a camera lens adjusting to the light. The mouth, when it opened in a parody of a smile, contained row upon row of needle-thin teeth that extended far back into a throat that seemed to open into endless darkness. "Found you," it said in that child's voice, the words distorted by those impossible teeth. "The others have been waiting for you." Thaddeus James Blackwood. I ran. There's no shame in admitting it. Anyone would have done the same. I turned and crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping against my face, roots seemingly rising from the ground to trip me. Behind me, that terrible childlike laughter echoed through the trees, joined by other voices, some high and keening, others deep and guttural, a horrifying chorus that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The darkness between the trees was alive with movement, darting shapes that kept pace with me, always just at the edge of my peripheral vision. My lungs burned with each gasping breath as I pushed myself harder, faster, driven by pure animal terror. The flashlight beam bounced wildly ahead of me, briefly illuminating twisted faces peering from behind trees, elongated limbs reaching toward me, only to disappear when the light fully caught them. I had no direction, no plan beyond putting distance between myself and that clearing. The compass was useless, spinning madly in my shaking hand. My only guide was the slope of the land. Downhill should eventually lead to water, and water might lead to civilization. I burst through a thicket and found myself teetering on the edge of a ravine, arms windmilling as I fought to regain my balance. Below me, perhaps 30 feet down, a stream glinted in the weak moonlight that somehow penetrated the canopy. As I stepped back from the edge, a sound froze me in place, the snap of twigs directly behind me. I turned slowly, raising my flashlight like a weapon, and found myself face to face with something that had once been human but wasn't anymore. It stood on two legs, but its proportions were all wrong. Arms too long, torso too thin, neck bent at an impossible angle. Its skin was pale as a mushroom cap and seemed to glow faintly with its own phosphorescence. Where its face should have been was a blank expanse of skin, interrupted only by a mouth that split its head nearly in half. "You wear our mark now," it said, the words somehow clear despite the lack of proper lips. "The forest has claimed you." It reached toward me with fingers that were more like roots, tipped with what looked like small mouths, each ringed with tiny teeth. I stumbled backward, forgetting the ravine behind me, and felt empty air where solid ground should have been. Time seemed to slow as I fell, the creature's silhouette receding above me, joined by others that peered over the edge with their featureless faces. Then came the impact, cold water that knocked the remaining air from my lungs, followed by the sharp pain of rocks beneath the surface. The current caught me immediately, tumbling me downstream like a rag doll. I fought to keep my head above water, choking and sputtering as the stream carried me away from my pursuers. Each time I managed to grab at an overhanging branch or protruding rock, the water seemed to surge, tearing me away again. It wasn't until I'd been carried at least half a mile that I finally managed to drag myself onto a muddy bank, coughing up water and shivering uncontrollably in the night air. My emergency pack was gone, torn away in the fall or the subsequent journey downstream. All I had left was the clothes on my back, my pocket knife, and the waterlogged phone that was about as useful as a brick. I couldn't stop to rest, though every muscle screamed for relief. They would be following. I knew this with absolute certainty. The forest wanted me, had marked me somehow, and it wouldn't give up its prize so easily. I forced myself to my feet, using the stream as my guide, following it downhill away from that accursed campsite. The trees seemed less dense here, the undergrowth less tangled, which I took as a hopeful sign. Civilization couldn't be too far away. People had built Salem near water sources, after all. I just needed to keep going. Dawn was breaking when I heard the sound of traffic, faint but unmistakable, the hum of tires on asphalt like the most beautiful music I'd ever heard. I quickened my pace, ignoring the burning in my legs and the stinging cuts that covered my exposed skin. The trees were thinning, light breaking through in shafts that seemed solid enough to grasp. I was going to make it. I was going to survive this nightmare and tell a story no one would believe. That's when I saw the stone circle, 7 rough pillars arranged in a ring directly in my path. Each stone was covered in the same symbols I'd seen carved into the trees, now glowing with a sickly green light, in the pre-dawn gloom. The space between the stones shimmered like heat rising from hot pavement, distorting the forest beyond. I knew instinctively that this was a boundary, a threshold, and that crossing it was my only chance at escape. I also knew, with that same bone-deep certainty, that they were right behind me, closing in from all sides, herding me toward this circle that was both salvation and possibly another trap. I heard them moving through the underbrush, that strange, sliding gait that was almost human, but not quite right. The child thing's voice called my name again, stretching the syllables into something mocking and hungry. Decision time. Forward through the circle to whatever waited beyond, or backward to face what I knew was coming for me. Some choice. I closed my eyes, thought of Chicago and its blessed concrete and steel and complete absence of sentient forests, and ran forward into the stone circle. The world turned inside out. That's the only way I can describe the sensation of passing through that threshold. Like reality itself was a glove being pulled off a hand, inverting completely in the process. Colors inverted, sound became texture, gravity shifted sideways. I felt myself falling in all directions simultaneously, my body stretching and compressing in ways that should have torn me apart. Through it all, I heard them howling in rage or perhaps hunger, the voices of the forest and its inhabitants receding as if down a long tunnel. Then, abruptly, solid ground beneath my feet and normal air in my lungs. I found myself standing on the side of a highway, cars speeding past, their headlights cutting through the morning mist. Behind me was just an ordinary stretch of woods. No stone circle, no glowing symbols, nothing to indicate the horror I'd just escaped. My clothes were torn and muddy, my body covered in cuts and bruises that throbbed in time with my racing heart. I must have looked like a madman as I staggered into the road, waving my arms frantically at an approaching truck. The driver, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a salt and pepper beard, pulled over and rolled down his window cautiously. "You okay, buddy? You look like you've been through hell." I almost laughed at the understatement. I got lost in the woods. I managed to croak, my voice raw from screaming and swallowing stream water. "I need to get to Salem, to civilization." The man nodded, reaching over to open the passenger door. As I climbed in, overwhelmed with gratitude for this simple human kindness, he glanced at my palm, at the perfect puncture wound that now pulsed with the same sickly green light I'd seen on the stone pillars. His eyes widened slightly, but he said nothing as he put the truck in gear. I covered my hand quickly, but the damage was done. He knew, or at least suspected, and somehow, that terrified me almost as much as what I'd left behind in the forest. The truck driver's name was Malcolm Proctor, a lifelong Salem resident who seemed unsurprised by my disheveled appearance or wild story. He listened quietly as I rambled, occasionally nodding as if my tale of sentient forests and inhuman pursuers was perfectly reasonable. It wasn't until we reached the outskirts of Salem that he finally spoke. "Those woods have a history," he said, his weathered hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. "Not just the witch trials, something older. Something the original settlers encountered when they first came here. The locals know to stay clear of certain areas, especially around Hallow Moon, which is what we're approaching now. Malcolm dropped me at a small clinic rather than the hospital I'd requested. They'll ask fewer questions here," he explained, scribbling something on a scrap of paper that he pressed into my unmarked hand. "When you're patched up, go to this address. Ask for Miriam. Tell her Malcolm sent you, and that you've been marked by the Pale Ones." Before I could respond, he was back in his truck and pulling away, leaving me swaying on the sidewalk, clutching his cryptic note like a lifeline. The clinic was run by an elderly doctor who cleaned my wounds without comment, even when he saw the puncture in my palm that now seemed to be spreading, thin green lines extending from the wound like roots seeking soil. He gave me antibiotics that we both knew wouldn't help and a knowing look that sent chills down my spine. "Whatever you do," he said as I was leaving, "don't go back to the woods. They've tasted you now. They'll be waiting." I found my way to the address Malcolm had given me, a centuries-old cottage on the outskirts of town, its gardens overflowing with herbs I couldn't name and flowers that seemed to track my movement as I approached the door. Miriam turned out to be a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much. She took one look at my hand and pulled me inside, past walls lined with books whose titles made my vision blur when I tried to read them. "You're lucky," she said, though her tone suggested the opposite. Most who are marked don't make it out of the woods at all. What followed was a crash course in Salem's true history. Not the sanitized tourist version I'd consumed at the museums, but the dark underbelly that locals whispered about behind closed doors. The witch trials, she explained, weren't about religious hysteria or ergot poisoning, as historians claimed. They were a desperate attempt to fight back against something that had been in these woods long before Europeans arrived. Something that the native tribes had managed to contain through rituals and boundaries that the settlers, in their ignorance and arrogance, had disrupted. What you encountered, Miriam said, examining my palm with a magnifying glass, were the pale ones, servants of what lives deeper in the forest, in places between reality. For 3 days, I stayed in that cottage while Miriam tried everything to remove what she called the claiming mark from my hand. Poultices of strange-smelling herbs, incantations in languages that hurt my ears, ritualistic baths in water that seemed to move against my skin with purpose. Nothing worked. The green lines continued to spread, now reaching my elbow, and with them came dreams more vivid than reality. Dreams of returning to the forest, of finding the stone circle again, of stepping through to what waited on the other side. Dreams that didn't feel like dreams at all, but invitations. Or commands. On the 4th night, I woke to find myself standing in Miriam's front yard, the cool night air raising goosebumps on my skin. I had no memory of getting out of bed or walking outside. My marked hand was raised toward the distant tree line, the green lines now pulsing in time with my heartbeat. Miriam found me there, her face grim in the moonlight. "It's progressing faster than I thought," she said, leading me back inside. "You can't stay here anymore. You need to go somewhere they can't reach you." The next morning, she gave me a small leather pouch filled with herbs and what looked disturbingly like bone fragments, along with instructions to find a man in Arizona who dealt with similar cases. "The desert is your best bet," she explained. "They're creatures of the forest, of decay and regrowth. The dry lands weaken them." She drove me to the bus station herself, making me promise not to return to Salem, not to enter any forest until I reached the man who might be able to help me. I never made it to Arizona. Halfway across Pennsylvania, I got off the bus at a rest stop and simply walked away. Not a conscious decision. My body moved of its own accord, drawn northwest toward home. Toward Chicago. I hitchhiked, stole a car when necessary, always moving, always feeling the tug in my marked hand pulling me onward. The green lines had reached my shoulder now, spreading across my chest in a pattern that looked disturbingly like the root system of a tree. Or a map. I reached Chicago 3 days later, gaunt and feverish, the mark now visible at my collar and creeping up my neck. My apartment building looked exactly as I'd left it, a mundane monument to my former life. Mrs. Castillo from Forby nodded to me in the lobby, then did a double take at my appearance. I ignored her concerned questions and climbed the stairs to my unit, each step heavier than the last. Inside, everything was covered in a thin layer of dust. Melanie had taken what she wanted and left the rest, frozen in time like a museum exhibit of a failed marriage. I should have kept going to Arizona, should have listened to Miriam, should have done anything but what I actually did, which was collapse into my bed and fall into the deepest sleep of my life. In my dreams, I returned to the forest, not as prey this time, but as something else, something welcome. I walked between the trees on feet that weren't quite feet anymore, greeted by the pale ones who now seemed like family. The child thing took my transformed hand, led me deeper into the woods than I'd ever gone, to a clearing where the thing that was the heart of the forest waited. I know what it showed me there. I know what it offered, and what it asked in return. And God help me, I agreed. When I woke, the apartment was different. The walls were damp, the carpet spongy beneath my feet. Small mushrooms, the same pale, spotted variety from the forest, had sprouted in the corners and along the baseboards. My phone, when I checked it, showed dozens of missed calls from Miriam. The last message simply read, "It's too late, isn't it? They're coming through you." She was right. The forest had found a way to spread beyond its boundaries, using me as its conduit. The mark had transformed me into something between human and other, a doorway, a bridge between worlds. I sit here in my apartment, watching the mushrooms spread, feeling the wood of my desk soften and shift beneath my fingers that are now more like roots. Outside, I can hear the confused shouts of my neighbors as the transformation spreads through the building. Soon, it will reach the street, then the block, then beyond. A forest in the heart of Chicago, growing at impossible speed. The perfect revenge against concrete and steel and all the artifice of human civilization. I'm writing this as a warning, though I know it's already too late. The pale ones are in the next room, whispering in their slithering language, making plans. The child thing sits beside me as I type, its too wide smile reflected in my computer screen. If you're reading this, it means they've allowed it to be found. It means they want you to know what's coming. It means they've already spread far beyond this apartment, this city. Whatever you do, don't go into the woods. But then again, soon you won't have to. The woods are coming to you, and they're hungry. My name's Rowan J. Halewood, and I'm a 29-year-old traveler from Buffalo, New York. I'd never thought of spending more than a weekend in this old town, but there I was, driving in my Toyota RAV toward legends I'd only read about. Everything felt surreal the moment I crossed the city limits. The sky seemed darker, like some ancient force was dimming the sunlight just for kicks. Still, I brushed off my unease, convincing myself that it was nothing more than excitement mixed with road trip jitters. Little did I know, Salem was about to deliver a horror story beyond anything I'd imagined. The plan was straightforward. Link up with a few friends who shared my fascination with odd places, set up a campsite on the outskirts of Salem, and absorb all the local myths we could handle. We'd heard about the infamous Salem witch trials in school, of course, but the deeper legends, less publicized but equally disturbing, were what really drew us in. Stories of eerie forests that seemed to shift at night, cryptic symbols carved into trees, and shadows that didn't quite look human made us shiver and laugh at the same time. I guess we all assumed it was the perfect recipe for a good scare, something to spice up our social feeds and give us bragging rights afterward. I remember that first day setting up camp. The sky was this dull gray that seemed oddly suffocating. As I hammered in the tent stakes, the wind would pick up and carry the faint sound of something rustling in the distance. I couldn't tell if it was an actual creature or just the leaves swirling around. Every now and then, I'd hear what sounded like footsteps, but whenever I turned, I saw nothing. I joked with my buddies, calling it the Salem welcome party, but their nervous chuckles told me they felt the same creepy weight pressing in on us. The sun was still out, yet the forest was somehow darker than it should have been. We'd barely finished setting up when my friend Dylan insisted we check out a nearby clearing rumored to be a haunted meeting spot centuries ago. Local tales said you could sometimes see flickering lights where witches once gathered, chanting into the night. As we made our way there, the air went still, like even the birds decided this area wasn't worth the trouble. A sense of unease clung to my gut, and I found myself trying to breathe quietly, as if I didn't want whatever roamed these woods to notice us. It might sound silly, but in Salem, you learn real quick that humor is your best shield against fear, until something breaks that shield for good. When we finally arrived at the clearing, we found a circle of blackened stones that looked ancient. Could have been from a long-ago campfire, or maybe some cryptic ritual I didn't want to think about. The guys started messing around, making up incantations and ghostly voices to freak each other out. I tried to laugh it off, but the more I looked at that ring of stones, the more a chill crept down my spine. It felt like we were standing on a stage built for terror. I noticed the hairs on my arms standing straight up, and every small noise behind me made me spin around, expecting to see a figure in the trees. Later that evening, we settled around our own little campfire, telling each other stories that ranged from mildly scary to downright disturbing. The flickering flames danced on our faces, and every crack of wood seemed amplified by the darkness around us. We tried to lighten the mood by roasting marshmallows and poking fun at each other's nerves, but deep down, we all sensed we were in a place that carried too much history to ignore. It's one thing to read about witch trials or curses in a history book. It's another to sit under the same moonlit skies where it all went down, the echoes of the past seeming to breathe around you. It's wild how quickly your senses adapt to fear. Every time someone got up to grab a snack from the cooler, the shadows they cast looked elongated and off-kilter. I kept feeling like something was watching me from behind, even though I never saw any eyes. After a while, The conversation drifted to modern Salem, how it balances the touristy attractions with the darker legends. Some folks say the real Salem is like an iceberg. What's visible is just a fraction of what's hidden beneath. Honestly, I started believing that. We hadn't even hit midnight yet, and I already felt like I was part of some twisted bedtime story. Right before we planned to turn in, a loud snap echoed through the woods. We all froze, hearts pounding like crazy. Could have been a branch breaking under a raccoon's weight, sure. But in that moment, every legend and rumor felt painfully real. Dylan shot me a look like, we should check it out. And all I could do was gulp down my nerves and nod. We grabbed our flashlights, scanning the perimeter. The beams of light cut through the darkness, revealing twisted tree trunks and gnarled roots, but no sign of anything alive. The silence that followed was almost more terrifying than any monstrous sighting could have been, because it left our imaginations to run wild. Eventually, we gave up and decided to call it a night, but not before we all muttered silent prayers that the snap really was just a branch and not a signal from something far more menacing. That was just day one in Salem, and the dread was already creeping under my skin. I tried to sleep, but a strange, electric tension filled the air. The forest outside seemed to hum with an ancient energy, as if it was waiting for something or someone to make a mistake. And honestly, we were clueless about what we'd just stepped into. It wasn't until later that I realized our little adventure was about to plunge into true horror territory, way beyond a mere ghost story or local myth. I woke up on the second morning feeling like I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't fully remember. My head still throbbed from tossing and turning all night, and I had this gnawing sense that something had prowled around our campsite while we were asleep. Dylan and Sloan looked just as worn out, dark circles under their eyes telling me none of us got much rest. We tried to act normal, joking about how we needed a strong coffee or maybe a full pot of it. Deep inside, though, I knew we were all thinking about what happened out there in the woods. Those footprints, the eerie chanting, and the faint feeling of something unseen creeping behind the trees. By midday, we decided we couldn't just sit around waiting for another scare. Doing nothing would drive us insane, so we started planning our next move. We figured we'd investigate more, but this time stick closer to the campsite. It felt safer to stay within sight of our tents, even if the place gave off unsettling vibes. Plus, we wanted to check our surroundings for any signs of who, or what, had been leaving those bare footprints. Part of me thought it was a local prank, but another part whispered that this might be one of those disturbing Salem tales come to life. We took turns circling the perimeter, moving carefully through the dense underbrush. The deeper we wandered, the more the world seemed to vanish behind dark greenery. It was like the forest was swallowing up every sound except our nervous breathing. At one point, I stumbled across a cluster of strange carvings etched into an old oak tree, patterns that looked more like warnings than decorations. They reminded me of the symbol on that headstone we'd seen the day before. I felt a jolt of panic, and my heart pounded so loud I was sure the others could hear it. We tried to snap a few pictures, but the camera kept glitching, as though the forest didn't want its secrets exposed. Sloan found a patch of ground littered with half-burned candles. They were different sizes, some coated in dried wax that had dripped down their sides like melted flesh. She called us over with a shaky voice, and I could practically see the fear shining in her eyes. There were no footsteps nearby, at least not any we recognized, but something about that cluster of candles felt too recent, too fresh. It was as if someone, or something, had been performing a ritual right under our noses. A cold shiver ran through me, and I realized we might be dealing with more than just spooky Salem folklore. We regrouped by the tents, trying to piece together a plan that didn't sound completely reckless. It was obvious that we'd stumbled upon something bigger than ghost stories. Dylan suggested we head into town for more supplies, maybe talk to some locals who knew about these woods. I was all for it. The idea of being around other people and stepping away from the constant scary aura seemed like a lifeline. The problem was, a part of me worried that once we left, we might return to find our campsite destroyed, or worse, find something lurking in our gear. In the end, curiosity won out again. We agreed to split for a couple of hours, just long enough to grab groceries and maybe poke around the local library for historical records on these grounds. As we drove into town, I couldn't help feeling like we were temporarily escaping a sinister bubble. The The bright daylight and the sight of familiar stores made everything feel normal, but my mind was still stuck in those woods, replaying every unnerving detail. When we asked the librarian about old maps or unusual happenings near our campsite, she got this odd look on her face, like she knew more than she was willing to share. We didn't get much out of her except a few musty books on Salem's lesser-known legends. One passage mentioned a wandering congregation that held secret ceremonies in remote places, never staying long enough to leave a permanent mark. Another referenced lost travelers who stumbled upon strange gatherings and vanished without a trace. None of it was concrete, but the parallels to what we'd witnessed were too strong to ignore. Dylan's face went pale as he read about how the forest itself seemed alive during these rites, bending to conceal the participants from any outsiders. When we finally hauled our supplies back to camp, the sun was already sinking. My stomach twisted into knots as I stepped out of the car, half expecting to see our tents torn to shreds. But everything looked the same, except for a single bare footprint near the tree line, fresh in the dirt, pointed right at us like a warning. In that moment, all the hairs on my neck stood on end. Our day of researching had only led to more questions, and now it felt like we were being watched again. I had the awful sense that the real terror was just beginning, and each choice we made might push us closer to a point of no return. I spent most of that night wide awake, replaying every unsettling moment we'd experienced so far. Dawn broke with a hazy light that did nothing to clear my mind or calm my nerves. The weird footprint by the tree line had put all of us on edge, and even breakfast felt tense. Nobody really wanted to talk about how scary things were getting, so we mostly just chewed in silence. Still, we knew we couldn't ignore what was happening. There was clearly a line between spooky campfire tales and the actual horror we were diving into. Something, or someone, was out there, and it felt like they were trying to warn us off, or maybe lure us deeper. Our first real jolt came when Dylan noticed the candles from the day before had somehow moved overnight. We'd left them scattered in one spot, but now they formed a perfect circle about 10 yards from our tents. No footprints, no drag marks, just a circle of half-burned candles that hadn't been there when we went to sleep. We all stood there, staring with our mouths hanging open, trying to rationalize how this could have happened. The strangest part was the ground beneath them looked darker, almost like it had been scorched. Instantly, my stomach lurched with the disturbing realization that nothing about this situation was random. We decided to search the outskirts of our camp, pairing up so we wouldn't be alone. Sloan and I took the southern perimeter while Dylan and the others scouted the north. The trees looked thicker than they had any right to be, branches twisting into strange shapes overhead. I caught glimpses of something flickering between the trunks, like someone holding a mirror to the sun, but whenever I tried to focus, it vanished. Meanwhile, Sloan kept checking behind us, convinced we were being followed. I tried to stay calm, but the tension was making my heart hammer so hard it felt like the forest could hear it. We reconvened at camp with more questions than answers. Dylan swore he heard voices, whispers drifting on the breeze, but he couldn't make out any actual words. Another friend, Travis, said he felt like the forest floor was vibrating at one point, pulsing beneath his boots. Normally, I'd have laughed, but after everything else we'd seen, I wasn't about to dismiss anything as impossible. All of us sat in a rough circle, comparing notes, feeling the weight of Salem's eerie legends closing in. Each weird event by itself might be explained away as a trick of the mind, but together they painted a picture that was growing more disturbing by the minute. That afternoon, we decided to venture beyond our usual boundaries again, but this time we'd move as a single group. The idea was to keep an eye out for any signs of rituals or gatherings, stuff like those weird candles or even subtle markings on the trees. We walked deeper into the woods than ever, the undergrowth thick with tangled briars that scratched at our ankles. Every so often, we'd stumble onto a small clearing, only to find fragments of burnt cloth or odd stone formations that made no sense. In one clearing, we discovered a shallow pit lined with wooden planks, almost like someone had tried to build a crude bunker. The air down there smelled stale, and I got the overwhelming sense we weren't the first people to stand in that spot. At some point, we came across a trail of mushrooms arranged in a crescent shape. It might sound trivial, but something about how precise they were set off alarm bells in my head. I remembered old folklore about fairy rings and witch circles, how they supposedly marked portals to other realms or warnings to stay away. I couldn't tell if it was the latter, but Dylan wouldn't even step near them. He claimed he felt a wave of heat rolling off the mushrooms, which honestly sounded ridiculous, until I got close enough to feel my own face flush. It was real. Whatever was happening here, it was definitely not normal. All of this would have been nerve-wracking enough, but the real terror hit us just before dusk, when the sky turned a muddy red. We heard a distant chant rise up from somewhere in the forest. At first, it sounded like the wind weaving through the branches, but as it grew louder, we realized it was a chorus of voices, low and rhythmic. It cut right into my core, each syllable vibrating with an ancient energy I couldn't explain. We froze, exchanging panicked looks, not sure whether to run or hide. Just as suddenly as it began, the chanting stopped, replaced by total silence. No birds, no wind, nothing. It was like the entire forest had been holding its breath, waiting to see what we would do next. That night, back at camp, we huddled around the fire with the flames casting dancing shadows on our faces. Nobody felt like joking anymore. This wasn't just some haunted camping trip gone spooky. We were caught in a web of rituals, curses, or whatever dark secret Salem's history had locked away. Every crack of a branch made me jump, expecting something sinister to emerge from the blackness. My nerves were shot, and I could see the same dread etched into my friends' expressions. It was painfully clear that the real threat had shown itself, and we'd willingly stepped right into its territory. The question looming in everyone's mind was simple and terrifying. How do we get out before it's too late? By the time twilight fell on our third day, it felt like the very air was closing in on us. Every whisper of wind sounded like a warning we couldn't quite interpret, and I swear the forest itself had shifted. Paths we'd walked before seemed to vanish, and familiar landmarks appeared twisted or out of place. We'd spent the afternoon debating whether to leave immediately or tough it out one more night, but nobody wanted to hike out in the dark with all the strange chanting and flickering lights we'd witnessed. Our nerves were shredded, and tension flared every time someone snapped a twig underfoot or accidentally brushed against a branch. It was as if we were living inside a horror movie, praying we'd get to see the sunrise in one piece. Night came with unsettling speed. Even the stars seemed dimmed, swallowed by heavy clouds that hovered like a threat over our camp. The firelight danced across our faces, revealing wide-eyed expressions that none of us could hide anymore. I kept telling myself to calm down, that we'd wake up and laugh at how paranoid we'd been. But every time I glanced into the darkness, I remembered the circle of candles, the haunting chants, and those bizarre footprints. Sleep was out of the question, so we decided to huddle together, hoping there was some safety in numbers. Still, my mind wandered to every disturbing possibility. Were we actually trapped here with something malevolent lurking just beyond sight? Around midnight, the forest came alive with the type of silence that's louder than any noise. The wind stopped, the insects quieted, and even the crackling fire seemed to burn without sound. In that suffocating stillness, we heard what we dreaded, soft chanting, drawing closer. This time, it wasn't distant or vague. It was real, audible, and coming from somewhere just behind the dense line of trees to our west. My heart hammered, and I saw Dylan's face go pale as he gestured for us to kill the fire. We doused it as quickly as we could, plunging ourselves into darkness, hoping to become invisible. My pulse throbbed in my throat, and I silently prayed whoever was out there would pass us by. But the chanting didn't fade. It grew louder, more insistent, like a ritual reaching its climax. We heard footsteps moving in a slow, deliberate pattern, and I could just make out the faint glow of torches weaving through the trunks. Any doubt that this was some teenage prank evaporated. This was calculated, eerie, and terrifyingly real. Suddenly, a high-pitched scream tore through the silence, and the chanting halted. Every cell in my body screamed for me to run, but I couldn't move, too paralyzed by fear. Then, as if on cue, the torches flickered out, and everything went quiet again. That moment of stillness was more horrifying than the noise, because it felt like the forest was deciding our fate. We realized we couldn't stay there another second. If these people, or things, were dangerous enough to perform midnight rituals, we had zero intention of finding out how guests might be treated. Dylan shot me a look, one that screamed we needed to pack up and bolt. In total darkness, we gathered only what we could grab in a hurry. Some food, our backpacks, whatever flashlights and batteries we could find. The tents and heavier gear would have to stay behind. With adrenaline pounding in our veins, we crept away from the campsite, stumbling over roots and rocks, forcing ourselves to keep quiet as best we could. The urge to scream or sob was overwhelming, but fear kept our voices locked behind clenched teeth. We didn't follow any established trail, didn't trust the paths we knew, given how the forest seemed to shift under our feet. Instead, we used our flashlights sparingly, guiding each other through thick underbrush and praying we wouldn't step into a hidden ravine. Every so often, we'd hear a branch crack behind us or sense something moving in the darkness. In that moment, all my senses felt heightened. Every rustle of leaves turned into a possible threat. Every twig snapping might be our pursuer closing in. My throat felt raw from swallowing my screams. Despite the danger, we pushed on, determined to outrun whatever horrifying presence lurked in those woods. After what felt like hours of stumbling, we came upon a dirt road half hidden by overgrown bushes. Relief slammed into me so hard my knees nearly buckled. A road meant a way out, maybe even a chance to find another camper or a passing car. We paused just long enough to catch our breath. Our clothes were ripped, our faces streaked with sweat and dirt, but the cold night air against my skin was like a wake-up call. I looked back at the twisting shadows behind us, half expecting to see torchlight or an ominous figure stepping into view. But the forest seemed still, as though it was letting us go for reasons I couldn't begin to understand. We followed that road, staying close to the tree line in case we needed cover, until we spotted a faint glow in the distance. It turned out to be a single streetlight on the edge of a small gas station lot. I can't describe the rush of hope I felt at the sight of flickering neon signs. We staggered toward it, hearts pounding, minds reeling with questions about what we'd just escaped. My mind kept replaying the ritualistic chanting, the chilling scream, and the abrupt silence that followed. Even though we'd outrun the immediate threat, the horror clung to us like a second skin. We were safe for the moment, but I had this gut-wrenching feeling that Salem's shadows weren't done with us yet, and that the worst might still be waiting to claim its due. I woke up the next morning with a crushing sense of dread that felt almost physical, like a heavy weight pressing on my chest. We'd spent the rest of the night huddled at that tiny gas station, trying to convince ourselves we were safe under the buzzing neon lights. None of us slept much, and when dawn finally broke, it felt more like a grim reminder that we couldn't hide there forever. Part of me wanted to just get in my car and floor it until Salem was just a memory in my rearview mirror, but we still had friends missing. Travis and Sloan had wandered off before we reached the station, and we never saw them again after that. We all hoped they'd found some other route to safety, but deep down, a disturbing thought gnawed at me. Maybe they were lost to this horror for good. Dylan and I decided we couldn't just vanish without answers. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was desperation, or maybe Salem itself exerts a pull on you once you've tasted its darkness. We loaded up on supplies from the gas station, water, flashlights, some basic first aid materials, and asked the sleepy cashier if anyone else had passed through overnight. She said no and gave us a strange look when we described Travis and Sloan. Her eyes flickered with something like recognition, though she denied it when we pressed. It was enough to fire up our suspicions. Even in the supposedly safe outskirts of town, the eerie undercurrent remained, pressing in from all sides and making every street sign feel like it was directing us deeper into something we couldn't escape. We called the local authorities, but that turned into a dead end. The dispatcher sounded overworked and unimpressed, suggesting that maybe our friends just hitched a ride or found a motel. I nearly lost it right then, my voice trembling as I tried to explain the scary events we'd encountered. Hearing myself describe it, candles rearranging themselves, chanting in the forest, made me sound like a raving lunatic. The dispatcher told us to come in and file a report if we were really concerned, but I could sense the skepticism in her tone. With no leads and no real credibility, Dylan and I realized we were on our own. It was the kind of realization that hits like a punch in the gut, leaving you dizzy with the weight of what lies ahead. Still, something kept us from fleeing outright. Maybe we felt a twisted responsibility, or maybe we just couldn't accept leaving Travis and Sloan to whatever lurked out there. We ventured back toward those dense woods, but with a different plan this time. We'd stick to the dirt roads and keep as close as possible to any semblance of civilization. We rationalized that if we ran into trouble, at least we could dart back to the gas station or flag down a passing car. Deep inside, I knew that logic was a flimsy shield against the ancient menace nesting in Salem's wilds. But denial can be comforting when the alternative is raw panic. Not long after re-entering the wooded roads, we found an abandoned pickup with its doors hanging open. No sign of the driver, no sign of a struggle, just an empty cab and the faint smell of something metallic lingering in the air. My stomach twisted into a knot. The scene was too neat, too staged. We searched for a mile in both directions, calling out their name, but got nothing. The silence was unnerving, the kind that makes every rustling leaf sound like a threat. We tried to radio for help, but our phones were useless out there, and the old walkie-talkie we picked up gave only static. It felt like Salem was swallowing signals the same way it swallowed people. The more we dug in, the more the forest seemed to close ranks around us, as though punishing our refusal to leave. At dusk, we came across something that nearly made me drop my flashlight. It was a single shoe, Sloane's. I recognized it by the flower sticker on the side, sitting upright at the base of a twisted oak. Next to it was a scorched patch of earth and a shredded piece of fabric that looked like part of Travis's hoodie. My heart pounded so hard I could taste copper in my mouth. Dylan stared at the shoe in disbelief, his face ashen. We had no idea whether they'd been taken, had run off in panic, or something worse. Yet every instinct in my body screamed we were walking on the edge of a cliff. One wrong move, and we'd topple into the same terrifying oblivion that had claimed our friends. Determined not to meet the same fate, we moved quickly, guided more by raw survival instinct than any real plan. That's when we felt it, a shift in the air, like a vacuum pulling all warmth from the world. A figure emerged from behind a broken tree stump, robed in black, face hidden by a hood. Before we could react, a guttural chant rolled out, echoing off the trees. My knees buckled with an electric jolt of terror, and Dylan actually staggered backward, nearly dropping his flashlight. The robed shape raised an arm, and I felt a heavy pressure clamp down on my chest. It wasn't physical so much as spiritual, like fear weaponized. I tried to scream, but the sound strangled in my throat. For a split second, I thought we were done for, about to be dragged into some final, disturbing ritual. Then, as abruptly as they appeared, the figure vanished into the darkness, leaving only that oppressive chill behind. Gasping for breath, Dylan and I bolted, tears of pure panic streaking down our faces. We sprinted through the underbrush, ignoring the branches whipping our skin, ignoring our heaving lungs. By the time we burst out of the woods and back onto a gravel side road, the sky was black and starless, Salem's twisted silhouettes rising all around. We glanced back, half expecting to see the figure gliding behind us, but there was nothing, just empty shadows that offered no comfort. We finally slowed, hearts pounding like drums, realizing that we might never uncover the full, terrible truth of that place or find closure for our lost friends. What hit me hardest was the realization that we were alive, but not unscathed. We'd made a deadly mistake chasing answers in Salem. And if there's one thing I learned from this nightmare, it's that some questions should never be asked, because the real tragedy is living with what you can't unsee. My name's Beckett D. Farnsworth, and I'm a 32-year-old freelance photographer from Asheville, North Carolina. I was passing through Massachusetts in my Honda CR-V, chasing autumn foliage for a travel blog I sometimes contribute to, when I got the wild idea to camp near Salem's outskirts. Truth is, I was drawn in by the city's legends, those witchy tales and chilling stories that always hovered at the back of my mind, ever since I was a kid. I never expected to find something far more disturbing than any campfire yarn I'd ever heard. Sometimes, reality is way scarier than fiction. I got into Salem later than planned, mostly because I'd stopped every few miles to snap photos of the countryside. The trees seemed to glow with vibrant reds and oranges, but as I got closer to the city, that warmth faded into something else, like an undercurrent of dread humming beneath the picturesque scenery. It was the kind of vibe you can't quite pin down. You just feel it in the pit of your stomach. People in town were friendly enough, offering tips on which trails to hike if I wanted a good view. But every now and then, I'd catch someone shooting me a knowing look, like I was playing with forces I didn't understand. I picked a small campground just outside Salem, thinking it'd be a convenient launch pad for exploring local lore. The place was surrounded by tall pines, and though it was near a back road, the silence set in fast once night fell. I remember setting up my tent and feeling the wind pick up, rustling the branches in a way that felt almost staged, like the opening scene of a low-budget horror flick. I shrugged it off, telling myself I was just on edge because of the city's reputation. But my nerves refused to settle, making every crack of a twig sound a little too horror movie perfect. Late that first evening, I wandered around the campsite, flashlight in hand, searching for a good spot to capture star trails on my camera. The moon was out, giving everything an otherworldly glow, and the tall silhouettes of the pines looked downright haunting. But as I fiddled with my camera settings, I noticed a figure in the distance, just a brief glimpse of something moving between the trees. When I panned my light that way, there was nothing. No footprints, no crunch of leaves, nothing except my racing heart telling me I hadn't imagined it. I decided to call it a night, telling myself it was probably just another camper who'd turned in. The next morning, I chatted with a park ranger who dropped by. He was friendly enough, but got uneasy when I mentioned wandering around after dark. Said I should be careful venturing too far into the deeper sections of the woods because the terrain gets tricky and people have gotten lost out there. He didn't mention any local superstitions, but his eyes kind of shifted away when I brought up the old Salem witch lore. I've met my fair share of rangers, and most of them love a good ghost story. This guy just changed the subject, like it wasn't worth discussing. That only fired up my curiosity more. By midday, I decided to explore some nearby trails that supposedly cut through areas steeped in Salem's darker history. Along the way, I ran into another traveler, someone who claimed they'd camped there a few days earlier and had weird encounters, odd chanting at night, flickering lights in the woods, even a moment when they felt a hand graze their shoulder, only to find no one there. They looked rattled, but I chalked it up to being in an unfamiliar place. Deep down, though, their story lodged in my mind like a splinter. I couldn't ignore how scary it all sounded, but my inner skeptic tried to spin it as paranoia. That evening, I tried to brush off the unease by going into downtown Salem for a slice of pizza and to soak in some of the local tourist spots. The shops were full of witch-themed souvenirs and haunted walking tour flyers. A part of me laughed at how commercialized it all was, but the rest of me wondered if these glossy brochures barely scratched the surface of what truly lurked in the city's past. I'm all for a good scare, but something about Salem felt layered, like it was keeping its real secrets under lock and key. After dinner, I drove back to the campground, determined to be rational, but the pit in my stomach only grew heavier the closer I got. I returned to find my tent slightly collapsed on one side, like someone, or something, had messed with it. At first, I assumed it was the wind or maybe an animal sniffing around. But when I looked closer, I noticed strange markings in the dirt near the tent stakes, shapes I couldn't immediately identify. They looked vaguely like runes, swirling around each other in a twisting design that made my skin crawl. I felt this sudden chill, like the shadows themselves were pressing in, urging me to leave. Was it just a prank by some local teens? Possibly, but it sparked a new level of unease that stuck with me for the rest of the night, making sleep nearly impossible. Still, I told myself I'd stay put. Maybe I was being paranoid, or maybe Salem was just living up to its reputation. Either way, something told me that if I wanted a real story, photos, experiences, the kind of thing that could launch my photography career to new heights, this was the place to find it. Little did I know, the deeper truths of Salem weren't the kind you want to uncover lightly. There was a sense that I'd already crossed an invisible threshold, and once you cross it, there's no turning back. I could feel the city's darker pulse growing louder with every breath I took, stirring up an odd blend of excitement and dread in my chest. That next morning, I woke up feeling like a bundle of nerves ready to snap at any moment. Even though the sun was shining through the trees, I couldn't shake the memory of those weird runes near my tent. The campground seemed perfectly normal on the surface, birds chirping, leaves rustling. But there was a heaviness in the air, like the forest itself was trying to whisper something I couldn't quite catch. I tried to force down some breakfast, but my appetite wasn't having it. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those twisting shapes in the dirt. Call me paranoid, but I felt like something scary had latched onto me, following me into daylight. My plan was to snap some shots in the early sun, especially of the beautiful fall foliage. I figured focusing on photography might calm my nerves. I ventured a few hundred yards into the woods, drawn by the way the light filtered through the branches, illuminating the moss in a bright, almost supernatural green. At first, everything looked perfect, like a postcard scene. But as I set up my tripod, I noticed something off in the background of my lens. A single tree trunk had deep scratches carved into it, almost like claw marks, arranged in a pattern I'd never seen. My stomach did a little flip, and I immediately thought of the runes from last night. Could they be connected? I tried to ignore the goosebumps popping up on my arms, focusing on capturing the forest's morning light. The shutter clicked, and in that brief instant, I could have sworn I heard a low groan echo through the trees. I froze, waiting to see if it was just my imagination or some normal forest sound, maybe a branch creaking in the wind. But there was no breeze, and the woods were unnervingly quiet otherwise. A sudden chill washed over me, that primal sense of fear people mention when they feel eyes on their back. I spun around, half expecting to see someone, but there was only a thick swirl of mist hanging between the trunks. No footprints, no sign of life, just a silence that felt almost accusatory. Figuring I'd had enough excitement for one morning, I packed up my gear and headed back toward camp. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that each step was being matched by someone else's, hidden among the leaves. Every branch crackled at the same time my boot did. By the time I saw the clearing where my tent stood, I was practically speed walking, my breath hitching in my throat. When I got closer, I realized something was off. My tent flap was undone, swaying in a breeze that came out of nowhere. I'd zipped it up tight before leaving. Nervous energy surged through me, and I stepped inside, heart hammering like crazy. Nothing looked ransacked, but I noticed my spare camera batteries scattered across the sleeping bag, and my flashlight half buried under a blanket. It felt like someone had been there, poking around, but trying not to leave obvious evidence. Could it have been an animal? Possibly, but the way my stuff was laid out almost felt deliberate. The strangest part was a small, dusty footprint by the edge of the tent, too small for my foot, and too big to be from a raccoon or something. I just stood there, staring at it, feeling my pulse in my ears. The uneasy sensation that Salem's shadows were creeping an even closer gnawed at me, and suddenly, the day felt a lot less bright. Fighting off the urge to pack up and bolt, I told myself I'd at least try to get some answers. I headed back to the ranger's station, hoping I could find the same ranger from before, or at least someone who wouldn't dismiss me as a spooked tourist. The desk was occupied by a different ranger, a calm-looking woman with a name tag that read Harper. When I mentioned the runes and the footprint, she paused, her eyes flickering with concern. She said something about local teens playing pranks this time of year, but I could tell she didn't fully believe her own explanation. She warned me to stay safe, avoid straying off the marked trails, and maybe think about relocating to a more populated campground. After leaving the station, I wandered into Salem proper, feeling a strange cocktail of relief and dread. The lively streets and curious tourists made everything seem ordinary for a second, but it also highlighted how alien my recent experiences felt. Passing by a gift shop decked out with witch decorations, I caught my reflection in the window, pale, eyes a bit hollow. Part of me wanted to confide in someone, blurt out what I'd been seeing and feeling. But I knew it would probably just come out sounding like another run-of-the-mill ghost story in a town famous for them. I trudged on, half-heartedly snapping photos of historic buildings and old gravestones, hoping something would distract me from the unsettling vibe chewing at my nerves. Late that afternoon, I returned to my campsite, bracing myself for what I might find. Surprisingly, everything looked the same as I'd left it. No more footprints, no new runes. Still, I felt a presence lingering. Even the rustle of the leaves carried a weight, like an unspoken message that I was in over my head. I couldn't tell if I was just jumping at shadows or if Salem was truly alive in some dark, ancient way. Either way, I was cornered by curiosity and caution. I knew I should probably get out while I still could, but that spark of wanting to uncover the disturbing truth kept me tethered. In the back of my mind, I wondered what kind of problems would crop up next and whether I'd have the courage or the luck to face them head on. I spent half the night stirring in my sleeping bag, convinced I was hearing faint footsteps outside my tent. Every time I jerked awake, flashlight in hand, all I saw were the same silent trees and the flickering shadows cast by my lantern. I told myself it was just paranoia fueled by Salem's reputation, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. Around 3 in the morning, I heard what sounded like a hushed voice whisper my name. It might have been the wind, but it felt too deliberate. My heart nearly pounded out of my chest. By the time dawn broke, I was exhausted, and the notion that I was sharing this clearing with an unseen presence sent shivers through me. I spent the early part of the day trying to calm my nerves, walking the shorter trails near the visitor center. The crisp autumn air and the amber glow of the sun piercing through the branches almost made me forget the scary undertones lurking in these woods. Tourists wandered by with camera phones out, laughing and snapping selfies like this was just another scenic spot. I envied their ignorance. If only my mind wasn't filled with claw-like scratches on trees and footprints where no one should have been walking. But every time I considered bolting, a stubborn curiosity took hold. I felt compelled to unravel this mystery, however reckless that might be. After lunch, I hiked deeper into a section of forest where the trees grew so thick it felt like twilight all day long. The deeper I went, the quieter it got, like each step took me farther away from the safety of the everyday world. Off to the side of a barely visible path, I noticed what looked like a stone foundation, maybe the remnants of an old cabin or meeting house. The stones were covered in moss, but I could make out faint symbols etched into them. They weren't quite like the runes I'd seen before, but something about them made my skin crawl. I felt an overwhelming sense of being watched, like invisible eyes were peering from the thick brambles around me. That's when I picked up the faint scent of smoke, as if someone had just snuffed out a campfire. Curious, I followed the smell to a small clearing ringed by trees so dense they blocked out the sky. At the center stood a charred patch of earth surrounded by candle stubs, their wax melted into the dirt. My camera was already in my hands, but I hesitated before snapping any photos. It felt like I was intruding on something private and deeply disturbing, a ritual site left behind by whoever, or whatever, was using these woods for more than just ghost stories. The moment I took a shot, I swore I heard a twig snap behind me, and for a heartbeat, I thought my heart would stop right there. I spun around, but once again, there was no one in sight. The feeling of being watched only grew stronger, though, until I had to swallow hard just to keep from shouting into the empty air. My nerves frayed. I decided I'd seen enough and backtracked toward the main trail. Yet, the path seemed different, like it had shifted while I was in the clearing. Every turn looked unfamiliar, and the trees pressed in, forming a natural maze. For a terrifying half hour, I worried I'd stumbled into one of those horror tales about hikers who vanish without a trace. Eventually, I spotted a rusted signpost marking the main route, and the relief nearly brought me to my knees. Once I made it back to civilization, or as close as this part of Salem got to civilization, I tried to find Ranger Harper again. She wasn't around, and the guy behind the desk said she was out on patrol. When I mentioned the charred clearing and candle stubs, he gave me a tight-lipped frown but wouldn't comment. It felt like there was an unspoken rule in Salem not to dig too deep into its shadows. He just mumbled something about respecting local history and quickly redirected me to a brochure on safe camping practices. The tension in his voice told me he knew more than he was letting on, and that only made me more determined to figure out what was really going on here. Late afternoon turned to evening fast, bringing a chill that seeped through my jacket. I tried to busy myself by reviewing the photos I'd taken, grainy images of strange symbols, unsettling scratches, and that ominous candle circle. My heart pounded faster with each shot. What if I showed these pictures to the locals? Would they open up or call me crazy? The irony was, part of me worried they'd recognize something in the images that I didn't, and then I'd be in even deeper trouble. By the time dusk settled in, I couldn't ignore the dread pooling in my gut. It felt like an invisible clock was ticking down to something I wasn't prepared for. Nightfall arrived like a closing curtain, thick and suffocating. Even the streetlights near the visitor center did little to comfort me as I made my way back to camp. I half expected to see new footprints or claw marks, but what greeted me instead was somehow worse. My tent's entrance was standing wide open, lantern overturned, gear scattered on the ground. Fresh, Damp earth caked my sleeping bag as if someone had yanked it out and thrown it aside. No sign of animals, no sign of forced entry, just a violation so personal it made my stomach lurch. I could sense Salem's hidden threat breathing down my neck, as if warning me that the real terror was just beginning. And part of me knew I might already be too far in to escape unscathed. I waited until dawn cracked the horizon before I dared to move. Huddled in my car with the doors locked, I'd listened all night for crunching leaves or hushed footsteps, convinced someone, or something, was prowling the campsite. The tent was a lost cause. Every time I glanced in its direction, my stomach twisted at the thought of going back in. Once the dim morning light broke through, I finally worked up the courage to gather my scattered gear. My hands shook as I stuffed my sleeping bag into the trunk, feeling like I was trying to outrun a nightmare that was still unfolding in slow motion. Getting out seemed like the best option, but something about Salem wouldn't let me go that easily. I kept telling myself I was done, that I'd cut my losses and forget I ever came here. Yet, each mile I drove away from the forest seemed to stoke a growing sense of guilt in my chest, as if I was abandoning a riddle I was meant to solve. It sounds ridiculous, but there's a pull to this place, a darkness that lures you back, and no matter how scary or disturbing things get. By the time I hit the main road, my mind was already flipping through ways to uncover the truth without getting snatched by whatever lurked in those woods. I stopped by a small diner on the outskirts of Salem, hoping a strong cup of coffee would ground me. The place was nearly empty, just a couple of locals who eyed me with mild curiosity. I guess I looked like I'd been through a horror movie. The waitress, an older woman with tired eyes, poured me a coffee and asked if I was camping around here. My throat went dry. I admitted I'd been at a site nearby, but might leave soon because of some weird stuff happening. She gave me a tight smile, then leaned in and whispered that Salem's history isn't just old legends and tourist traps. It's real energy, and it can get under your skin. Her words sent a fresh wave of chills through me. I spent the rest of the morning flipping through local maps, comparing them with the photos I'd taken of ruins and strange markings. Nothing matched exactly, but I found a reference to an abandoned settlement rumored to be cursed since the colonial era. A few cryptic lines about unexplained vanishings, bizarre lights, and some secret society that supposedly met there long ago. The rational part of my brain screamed at me to walk away. These were exactly the kind of tales that lead people into trouble. But curiosity has a twisted way of overpowering common sense. Instead of heading out of town, I found myself driving toward that settlement's location. The deeper I drove into the back roads, the more I noticed how quiet everything was. Fewer houses, fewer signs, just long stretches of scraggly trees and gravel under my tires. It was mid-afternoon when I reached what looked like a sealed gate, rusted shut and overgrown with weeds. A half-hidden sign warned trespassers to keep out. If anything, it felt like a dare, so I parked the car, grabbed my camera, and slipped through a gap in the fence. Immediately, the atmosphere shifted, like stepping into a sealed-off world where even the sunlight seemed tainted. The wind whispered through branches in a low hiss, wrapping me in the undeniable sense that I was being watched. I walked for maybe half a mile before stumbling on the first sign of the settlement, a row of crumbling stone walls peeking through thick vines. They connected to what must have been small buildings ages ago, now collapsed and moss-covered. The silence was crushing, and every step felt like it carried some ancient echo. I was still on the lookout for any hints of those disturbing symbols, half expecting to see them carved into the stones. My intuition clawed at me, urging caution with every breath. This wasn't a place you casually document for a travel blog. It felt more like a trap set by Salem's darkest secrets, luring in the curious only to swallow them whole. Suddenly, a faint clang echoed through the ruins, like metal striking stone. My pulse spiked as I froze, ears straining to pinpoint the direction. It came again, clear enough to confirm I wasn't imagining things. I crept forward, crouching behind a partial wall that offered a bit of cover. Around the corner, I spotted something that made my blood run cold. A figure standing by a shattered doorway, dressed in a dark cloak. They were methodically hammering metal stakes into the ground, arranging them in a peculiar formation. The sight hit me like a jolt of electricity. What kind of ritual was this? And more importantly, how far would they go to keep it secret? My foot brushed against a loose pebble, sending it skittering. The figure jerked upright, turning a hooded head in my direction. Instinct kicked in, and I bolted, my heart thundering so loud it drowned out everything else. I nearly tripped over the crumbled stones, feeling an overwhelming sense of danger pouring from behind me. I didn't dare look back to see if they were following. I just sprinted until my lungs burned. The image of that cloaked shape burned into my mind. By the time I reached my car, I was gasping, tears stinging my eyes. The meltdown of adrenaline was so intense that I could barely get the key in the ignition. But one thought rang out above the fear. I'd seen something that wasn't meant for prying eyes, and if I stayed, I'd have to face whatever horrors this settlement guarded. I spent the next several hours trying to convince myself to leave Salem for good, but my mind was plagued by the images of that cloaked figure in the ruins. Every bone in my body screamed that I was courting disaster by staying, yet some twisted sense of duty, and maybe a hint of pride, kept me tethered. I drove around aimlessly, circling the outskirts, hoping a plan would crystallize in my head. At one point, I pulled over by an abandoned church that loomed at the end of a cracked road. The door was boarded up, but I found a small side entrance forced open. An uneasy curiosity pushed me forward, even though every fiber of common sense told me to back off. The air inside was damp, carrying a faint echo that sounded almost like a heartbeat. Stepping through the broken doorway felt like crossing another threshold into Salem's underworld. Dust motes danced in the faint light that trickled through shattered stained glass windows, casting distorted colors on the floor. Broken pews lay scattered, and an old altar stood at the far end, draped in a moldy cloth. As I approached, I noticed symbols etched into the stone, variations of those runes I'd seen in the campsite and on that ruined settlement's walls. My pulse drummed in my ears, a potent mix of horror and fascination. I lifted my camera to snap a shot, hoping to document something that might explain all of this disturbing mystery. Then a whisper, so soft I barely registered it, brushed against my ears. The voice sounded eerily familiar, though I couldn't place it. My heart lurched, and I whirled around with my flashlight raised. Shadows clung to the corners, too thick for midday. Each step I took echoed like a warning. The hush in the air felt charged, as if centuries of unspeakable acts were embedded in these walls. Despite the dread swirling in my gut, I kept moving, snapping photos of every rune I found, determined to collect evidence that something very real and very scary was at work here in Salem. I was so focused on capturing each detail that I almost missed the figure slinking in behind me. A flash of movement in the corner of my eye made me freeze. My flashlight beam landed on a shape cloaked in ragged black fabric. This wasn't the same imposing figure I'd seen at the settlement. It appeared smaller, even frilier. The hood partially slipped, revealing a pale face, eyes brimming with a strange mix of sorrow and menace. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't know whether to run or demand answers, but fear gripped me too tight for words. The figure raised a single finger to its lips, a silent plea for me to keep quiet, then melted back into the darkness before I could even react. Somehow, that silent warning unsettled me more than any scream could have. I stumbled out of the church, heart hammering like a drum solo in my chest. I felt certain I was being watched by more than just one presence, as though Salem had eyes hidden in every broken doorway. My hands shook as I turned the ignition of my car, the engine's roar momentarily grounding me in reality. I decided right then that I needed help, any help. Maybe the local authorities wouldn't believe me, but someone had to know what was really happening. Gritting my teeth, I sped toward a small police station near the edge of town, ignoring the knot of dread twisting in my stomach. At the station, the desk officer listened politely but wore a guarded expression. When I showed him the photos, candles in a clearing, strange runes, even that partial shot of the cloaked figure, he grimaced, glancing over at his partner before handing them back. He claimed folks in Salem took their historical reenactment seriously, suggested I stay in a motel for the night, and insisted there was nothing to worry about. His tone sounded as if he were reciting a script. When I pressed further, he became curt, almost agitated, advising me to leave if I didn't feel safe. Something about his reaction rang hollow, like he was following orders to downplay whatever lurked in these shadows. I walked out feeling more alone than ever, the weight of the unsolved horror crushing me. That's when I got a text from an unknown number. It simply read, I can help. East of the settlement at dusk. My entire body tensed. How had they gotten my number? Was this a trap, or genuinely the lifeline I'd been searching for? The logic part of my brain screamed at me to ignore it, but something else, a desperate hope for answers, won out. As the sun dipped behind Salem's skyline, I found myself driving back toward that forsaken area. My breath grew shallow the closer I got, a cold sweat pooling along my neck as I parked near a gnarled old oak. Dusk set the world on fire in hues of crimson and orange, and I navigated the crooked path by the last traces of daylight. At the edge of the settlement, the outline of a lone figure stood waiting. My heart galloped. Was it the same person from the church or another stranger entangled in Salem's bizarre underbelly? I forced my legs to move, stepping closer until I could make out the lines of a face illuminated by the dying light. Before I could speak, a shrill scream tore through the evening gloom, echoing across the abandoned stones. That scream snapped something in me. Logic dissolved into raw terror. In one panicked motion, I backed away, tripping over a broken piece of stone. My camera flew from my grip, shattering on impact. As I tried to scramble upright, another scream ripped through the silent air, louder, agonized, cutting off as abruptly as it began. In that frozen moment, I understood the finality of it all. There was no going back, no simple unraveling of Salem's secrets. Whatever help this stranger had intended was lost in the echo of that scream. Fear exploded in my chest, and I realized I'd made the worst mistake of my life by chasing shadows I was never meant to find. The last thing I remember is the flicker of torchlight appearing behind me, closing in like a stage curtain on the final act of a nightmare. Something collided with my head, and darkness swallowed my senses. In that final instant, I understood the real tragedy. Salem doesn't just harbor old legends. It devours those who dig too deep. And I dug until the horror consumed me whole. My name's Stella M. Rosewood, and I'm a 28-year-old emergency medical technician from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I drove into town in my Chevrolet Silverado after hearing rumors of the infamous Salem legends, tales of eerie forests and unexplained occurrences that might just make for a thrilling getaway from my high-pressure job. I expected a few horror stories told around a late-night bonfire, nothing too serious. But the minute I crossed into Salem's boundaries, an unshakable chill settled over me, like a silent warning echoing from centuries past. The locals seemed friendly enough at first glance, but I sensed a subtle caution in the way they spoke about the surrounding woods, as though they were guarding some scary secret. Even the kids who rode their bikes down the old main street appeared to steer clear of certain alleys and corners. I laughed it off initially, telling myself it was just Salem's gimmick, a tourist trap vibe amplified by ghost tours and pop-up haunted houses. Yet, beneath that playful veneer, my gut told me something more disturbing lay dormant, waiting for the right moment to surface. I decided to set up my campsite in a secluded spot recommended by a local ranger, somewhere quiet, tucked away under towering pines that swayed in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. The first evening went smoothly enough, just the soft crackle of my small fire, the faint buzz of insects, and the occasional owl hooting in the distance. If anything, the peacefulness felt too perfect, like stage scenery before the main act of a play. I tried to ignore the twinge of unease growing in my chest as the moon rose, bathing the woods in pale light. Around midnight, my radio started crackling with static, then cut off completely. I'm used to weird radio signals in remote areas, but this silence was a little too total, like the air itself refused to carry sound. It left me with the pounding of my own heart as the only thing I could hear. My flashlight beams stretched into the trees, revealing nothing but crooked branches and swirling fog. Still, the sense that someone was out there gnawed at me, making me jump at every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig underfoot. Come dawn, I tried to brush off the night's tension, telling myself I just needed coffee and fresh air. Yet the forest didn't greet me with the usual morning chorus of birds and breeze. Instead, there was this pressing hush that felt oddly claustrophobic, as if the woods had a mind of their own and were sizing me up. I found myself cutting breakfast short, then hiking a short distance to check out a nearby, clearing rumored to be connected to old Salem lore. I told myself it was pure curiosity driving me, but maybe it was something else entirely, some magnetism pulling me deeper into unknown territory. The clearing had a cluster of mossy stones at its center, arranged in a circle like a makeshift altar. A single dead crow lay in the middle, its wings splayed out in a haunting display that felt more ceremonial than random. My stomach lurched at the sight. I've seen my share of unsettling things in my line of work, but there was an eerie precision here that hinted at intent. I snapped a quick photo on my phone, feeling an irrational urge to document the scary scene, even if I couldn't explain it. On my way back, I spotted footprints in the damp earth, bare footprints, which made zero sense given how cold and rough the ground was. They meandered around the campsite like whoever left them had been circling, scouting. My heart thudded in my chest as I followed them to where they simply stopped, as though the person responsible had vanished into thin air. Every instinct roared at me to pack up and leave, but a nagging voice in my head kept insisting there was more to uncover. Salem felt like it had singled me out for some twisted invitation, and I wasn't sure if I was curious or frightened enough to accept. By the time I returned to camp, the morning sun was already high, and yet the clearing felt no warmer, no safer. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. My radio was still dead, my phone's signal flickered in and out, and I realized just how isolated I truly was. Despite the alarm bells ringing in my mind, part of me felt compelled to see this mystery through, maybe from stubbornness, maybe from a thrill-seeking spark. Little did I know, I was tiptoeing toward the jaws of something far more disturbing than any ghost story I'd ever heard. I woke up the next day to an unsettling calm. No birds singing, no rustling leaves, just a weighty silence that made the air feel thick. It struck me that the forest was quiet in a way that forests shouldn't be, as if it was waiting for something. My breath hitched when I noticed fresh footprints circling my truck. Again, they were bare, and they ended exactly where the tree began. I stared into those shadows, half expecting to see a face watching me, but the woods just stood there, silent, unyielding. I tried radioing for help. Nothing but static. My phone's signal flickered in and out, delivering only a garbled stream of half-loaded messages. Every time I moved, a knot of anxiety twisted in my gut, telling me I was out of my depth. As an EMT, I'm used to staying calm in emergencies. But this wasn't a car crash or a broken bone. This was the kind of creeping dread you read about in horror novels, the kind that seeps into your soul before you even realize you're in danger. Desperate for answers, I packed a small backpack with essentials and ventured along a narrow trail that snaked deeper into the woods. The trail seemed to darken the farther I went, the sunlight struggling to penetrate the canopy overhead. After a while, I came upon a series of carved symbols on the trunks, lines and circles woven in a style I'd never seen. They looked ancient, the wood around them darkened as if charred by some ritual fire. My pulse quickened. Instinct told me to turn back, but a stubborn curiosity pushed me on. Following the carvings led me to a clearing dominated by a massive stone slab. The forest floor around it was barren. No grass, no leaves, just hard-packed earth like an old scar. A circle of burnt-out candles ringed the slab, their wax pooled in sinister shapes. Even though it was daytime, the place oozed a coldness that made me shiver. I clicked a few photos on my phone, heart thumping like I was stealing something sacred. The quiet pressed in again, amplifying every tiny sound I made. As I turned to leave, a flash of white darted between the trees, too quick to be an animal, too tall to be a stray beam of light. My body froze. Adrenaline surged through my veins, and I fumbled for my flashlight, a pointless gesture in daylight. A branch snapped, echoing loud enough to make me flinch. Then, nothing. No footsteps, no second snap, just that impenetrable silence. It was worse than if I'd seen a figure outright, because my imagination filled the void with every scary possibility under the sun. Hightailing it back to camp, I found myself glancing over my shoulder more times than I could count. I half expected to see someone trailing me, barefoot, cloaked, or something else entirely. When I finally broke through the tree line, relief washed over me to see my truck and tent still there, untouched. But the relief was short-lived. A single black feather rested on my cooler, upright like it had been placed there with purpose. My chest tightened. Was someone taunting me? marking me with a twisted calling card. I spent the afternoon scouring online forums for any mention of similar symbols or rituals in Salem. My phone's signal was barely hanging on, but I stumbled across old references to forest congregations dating back to the 1700s. People spoke of midnight ceremonies, chanting, and a never fully identified presence that roamed the outskirts, preying on fear. The more I read, the more I felt the puzzle pieces click. This wasn't a random spook show. It was something deeply rooted in Salem's past. And I had a sinking feeling it wasn't done with me yet. As evening drew closer, that familiar hush returned, surrounding my campsite in a suffocating bubble. Every snap of the firewood sounded like a thunderclap in the quiet air. I could barely bring myself to eat, my stomach in knots. The forest seemed to watch me from every angle, its presence palpable. A grim realization settled in. Staying meant risking whatever lay beyond reason, but leaving without answers felt impossible. Salem had a hold on me now, and I sensed this night would push me to confront the echoes stirring in those ancient woods. Echoes that might just swallow me whole. Night fell with suffocating stillness. I kept the campfire burning brighter than usual, hoping its glow would push back whatever lurked in the dark. My body buzzed with adrenaline. Every muscle twitched at the slightest noise. At some point, the wind picked up, scattering embers into the sky like orange fireflies. Despite the heat, a bone-deep chill settled in my core. It reminded me of walking into an emergency scene back home. Only this time, there was no injured person to save, just me, alone in a nightmare with no protocol to follow. Around midnight, the forest woke up, or something in it did. I first heard a faint hum that I tried to pass off as the wind, but then it rose, a low chant reverberating between the trees. My heart pounded. I'd read the old stories, but hearing them brought to life was scary on a whole new level. The chant sounded too purposeful, each syllable dragging across the silence like a warning. Slowly, I stood and inched toward the tree-line, my flashlight cutting weak beams into the darkness. The chanting grew clearer but stayed just out of reach, luring me deeper. I don't know what possessed me to follow it. Curiosity, dread, maybe both. My boots crunched on twigs, the noise painfully loud in the hush. As I crept forward, the chant faded, replaced by an all-consuming quiet. Without thinking, I called out, "Hello." The question echoed back empty. Just when I thought I'd lost whatever it was, a dim glow flickered ahead, like a lantern struggling to stay lit. I crouched behind a fallen log, breath rattling in my chest. The lantern's flame revealed a figure huddled against a tree trunk, face obscured by a hood. My mind screamed at me to run, but my feet refused to budge. A soft voice, almost a whisper, drifted through the air. "Why are you here?" it asked, each word cracking like ancient bark. I forced down a surge of panic. I wanted to know the truth. I managed my voice trembling. The figure's hood tilted, as if studying me. Then, in one swift motion, the lantern went dark. Terror washed over me. There was a snapping branch, a rush of cold wind, and when I flicked my flashlight around, the figure was gone. In its place lay a single slip of paper, pinned to the ground with a small, rusted blade. I grabbed the blade and the paper, which bore a crudely drawn symbol, a circle with branching lines spiraling outward. It made my pulse spike. I recognized the style from the carvings on the trees. My flashlight dimmed and died at that exact moment, plunging me into total blackness. The chanting returned, this time closer, pounding in my ears like a slow drum. I scrambled through the undergrowth, scraping my arms on brambles. The hum rose in pitch, forcing a knot of pure fear to tighten in my gut. I had no choice but to flee blindly, guided by nothing but the faint glow of my smoldering campfire in the distance. Reaching the edge of my campsite felt like surfacing from underwater. My lungs burned, and my heart raced like it wanted to rip free from my chest. I checked my phone to see if I could at least document the blade or the symbol, but it was dead. No sign of battery drain before. It was just dead. Frustration collided with dread. I tossed the blade aside, feeling the weight of that moment seep into my bones. I'd witnessed something beyond logic or folklore, and it wasn't just going to let me go. Sleep was impossible. I sat by the dying embers of the fire, half expecting that hooded figure to appear any second. My mind cycled between questions. Who were they? What was this chanting that pulsed through the woods? And why did these events feel personal, as if the forest itself had chosen me? The darkest thought of all was whether there'd be a way out once I truly crossed the threshold of Salem's hidden horrors. I decided at first light that I couldn't last another day in this haunted limbo. I tossed everything into the bed of my truck, my hands trembling so badly I nearly dropped my spare flashlight. Even the morning sun felt weak, its rays filtered through a veil of low-hanging fog. My gut told me to leave Salem behind, put the disturbing chants and hooded figures in the rearview mirror for good. But a nagging sense of unfinished business anchored me to the spot, like invisible hands clutching my ankles. Part of me felt compelled to confront whatever had been beckoning me into these shadows, to prove I wasn't just another victim. A trembling moment passed as I stood by my truck's driver's door. My breath caught in my throat when I spotted something perched on the hood, another black feather, identical to the one I'd found before. This time, it was standing upright, shoved into the narrow gap between the hood and the windshield. I scanned the tree line, heart hammering. Nothing moved. It felt as though the forest was issuing a silent dare. Go ahead. Try and leave. My blood ran cold, but I forced myself to yank the feather free, stuffing it into my pocket as a grim memento of this twisted game. I started the engine and rumbled down the narrow dirt road. Every bump jarred my nerves, but I pressed on, determined to outrun the oppressive hush that seemed to follow me. Yet, not even a mile from the campsite, the truck's engine sputtered, then coughed out. The dashboard flickered, and I coasted to a stop, cursing under my breath. I'm no mechanic, but I knew enough to guess this wasn't some random breakdown. My mind raced, conjuring every sinister possibility. Had someone tampered with my engine overnight? Desperate, I popped the hood, half expecting to see severed cables or some arcane symbol scratched into the metal. But aside from a tangle of wires and hoses, nothing looked outright sabotaged. My phone still had no signal, the battery teetering near empty anyway. As I stood there in the creeping sunlight, I realized how exposed I was. The woods pressed in on both sides of the road, and an eerie hush hung in the air like a threat. I had no idea how far I was from the nearest house or any real help. A surge of raw fear washed over me, the kind that makes your bones feel like jelly. Grabbing my backpack, I headed on foot, steering clear of the forest edge as I walked down the gravel shoulder. The only sounds were my own ragged breathing and the crunch of rocks under my boots. Time blurred as I pushed forward, the sun inching higher without burning away the fog. Every twist in the road made my heart lurch, expecting to see that hooded figure waiting around the bend. Part of me longed for the relative safety of my truck. Even broken down, it had doors I could lock. At last, I spotted a weather-beaten sign for an old general store just ahead. Relief swelled in my chest, and I nearly sprinted the final stretch. But when I arrived, the store appeared shuttered, its windows boarded up. Confusion and dread coiled in my stomach. The paint-chipped door wouldn't budge, no matter how hard I pounded. A tattered notice flapped on the wall, dates too faded to read. It looked like this place had been abandoned for months, if not years. I leaned against the porch rail, my breath shaking, realizing just how alone I was. That's when I heard it again, the chanting. This time it wasn't coming from the woods behind me. It drifted from around the side of the building, low and rhythmic, like a dark lullaby. My blood felt like ice. Against my better judgment, I crept along the wall until I reached a cracked window. Inside, the store was dimly lit by a few candles on a counter, casting wavering shadows against shelves covered in cobwebs. I glimpsed figures in hooded robes, their backs to me, arms swaying in sync. A flicker of torchlight revealed one turning slightly, face hidden under a cowl. My stomach churned. I swallowed a gasp and forced myself to remain still, terrified they'd hear me. In that moment, I realized Salem was more than an old city with spooky tales. It was a living, breathing entity, and I'd stumbled into the heart of its secret existence. A cold sweat trickled down my neck as I backed away, biting down on the scream that threatened to escape my throat. Whatever was happening in that store was beyond any rational explanation, and I had no illusions about my odds if they discovered me peeking in. My only thought was to escape, again, hoping that somehow, somewhere along these lonely roads, I'd find a way out before this creeping darkness swallowed me whole. The chanting from inside that boarded-up store sent dread cascading through my veins. I hurried back to the road, every cell in my body urging me to run faster than I ever had before. My breath ragged, I pushed myself forward, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. The fog had thickened, so dense it felt like wading through a ghostly sea. The knowledge that my truck was useless kept me trembling. I was truly on foot now, at the mercy of these twisting back roads and whatever lurked in Salem's shadowy corners. After what felt like an eternity, I reached a weather-beaten sign pointing toward the main highway. Relief fluttered in my chest, but it was quickly smothered by a sense that I wasn't alone. Barely visible through the mist was a figure, someone standing motionless near the sign. My heart hammered like a frightened bird in a cage. I edged closer, praying this was a stranded traveler or a local who could help. As I approached, their outline became clearer. Hooded, pale hands folded in front. Before I could speak, they lifted a finger to their lips, the universal sign for silence. My stomach twisted in knots, fear surging like a hot wave. A strangled moment passed. Then, in a voice that seemed to echo with the forest's hush, the figure said, "The path is sealed for you." My throat closed, and I choked out, "What do you mean?" But they offered no explanation, only turned and vanished into the swirling fog as if they'd never been there at all. Desperation threatened to overwhelm me. I staggered forward, ignoring the pounding in my head. Salem had become a labyrinth of secrets, and every time I glimpsed a way out, something or someone pushed me deeper into its clutches. Still, I forced my feet to move, following the sign's direction. Step by labored step, the road began to look more familiar. It curved exactly the way the old map in my head said it should. My pulse soared with the possibility of escape, only to crash when the fog parted and revealed a blockade of fallen trees. They looked freshly cut, placed there to seal off the route. My eyes darted over the twisted branches, the raw edges of sawed trunks. This wasn't a random accident of nature. It was deliberate. A shaky anger replaced my fear, frustration pulsing through my veins. Was Salem itself barricading me, or was it the work of whoever lurked behind those hooded robes? Realizing I had no choice, I retraced my steps, heart thumping painfully. Soon, the chanting returned, not up ahead, but echoing from behind. I ducked into the trees, half crouching behind thick shrubs. Through the haze, I spotted multiple hooded shapes gliding down the road. Their voices wove together in a low, rhythmic call, sending prickles up my arms. I clamped a hand over my mouth, fighting the urge to scream as they passed by. My mind spun with questions. Were they searching for me? Had they blocked the road to ensure I couldn't escape? When the chanting faded, I crept out, pulse thrumming so hard I felt dizzy. The fog lifted just enough to reveal a narrow path veering off from the main road, barely more than a foot trail. Gulping down air, I followed it in a desperate bid to avoid any more scary encounters. The forest closed in around me, branches clawing at my jacket like skeletal fingers. Time dissolved into a blur of pounding heartbeats and the crunch of damp leaves underfoot. For a split second, I thought I saw a torchlight flickering through the trunks behind me, but I was too terrified to confirm. I just ran. Eventually, the path opened up onto a clearing dotted with twisted, leafless trees, each one carved with those familiar runes I'd encountered near my camp. Centered among them was a single, ancient oak with a hollow in its trunk. A cold dread coiled in my stomach as I realized I'd stumbled upon the very heart of Salem's secret. A sudden rush of wind made the trees sway, the runes seeming to writhe in the dim light. My instincts told me this clearing wasn't just a random spot. It was a focal point, a place where centuries of disturbing rituals converged. And I'd practically delivered myself to its doorstep. A low rustling sound made me spin around, hard in my throat. Hooded figures emerged from the tree line. 3, 4, maybe 5. They moved in silent unison, forming a semicircle that blocked any route of escape. My mouth went dry, and I took a step back, only to feel the solid trunk of the oak behind me. Panic pounded in my ears, the chanting swelling to a crescendo in the background. As the circle tightened, I realized this was where the horror truly began, where Salem's hidden terrors claimed their due. My mind shrieked for a miracle, but deep down, I knew I'd crossed into a realm from which few returned. And in that final heartbeat, I accepted that sometimes the darkest truths are the ones that refuse to let go. My name's IVP Blackwood, and I'm a 30-year-old social worker from Tampa, Florida. I hit the road a couple of weeks ago, seeking a much-needed break from the heavy emotional toll my job can sometimes bring. When I heard about the rustic campgrounds on the outskirts of Salem, I figured it would be the perfect place to clear my head. Cool autumn air, a bit of American folklore, and that sweet sense of freedom you only get when you're hundreds of miles from home. I loaded up my Ford F-150 with a tent, some basic supplies, and a determination to enjoy my break, no matter what. I'd visited Salem briefly as a teenager, back when all I knew about it came from tourist brochures and those old stories about witch trials. This time, the drive felt different, like the roads leading into town were lined with old secrets just waiting to bubble up to the surface. Maybe it was the way the last rays of sunlight caught the tops of the trees, giving everything a strange orange glow. Or maybe it was the sudden hush that seemed to fall when I crossed the sign welcoming me to Salem. Whatever it was, I felt a small, unsettling prickle at the back of my neck, the kind you get when you sense something's off but can't put your finger on it. I found a campsite about half an hour from the main downtown area, near a dense patch of forest that local rumors claimed was tied to some lesser-known Salem lore. The campsite itself looked pretty standard: a few designated fire pits, a communal water pump, and a scattering of fellow campers who were already winding down for the night. Still, I couldn't ignore the vibe in the air. It wasn't just spooky because of the city's reputation. It felt like the land itself carried an undercurrent of tension. It reminded me of a rubber band stretched too tight, like it might snap at any second. By the time I'd pitched my tent and settled in, darkness had swallowed the forest. I'm usually fine with the great outdoors, but something about those tall, swaying trees on the edge of my sight made me restless. I couldn't shake the notion that their silhouettes were just a little too still when the breeze passed through. Tossing my sleeping bag inside the tent, I tried to ignore the eerie hush taking hold. You know how sometimes, even crickets and frogs seem to go quiet, as if they sense a bigger predator around? That's exactly the feeling I got, and to be honest, it was downright scary. Hoping to distract myself, I lit a small fire and cooked some instant noodles while scrolling through photos on my phone. But the screen's glow only highlighted the dark shapes beyond. Every so often, I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see a shape lingering among the pines. When I tried to laugh it off, the sound felt hollow in my own ears. It was like I'd walked into a place where the veil between normal life and the disturbing unknown was dangerously thin, and my usual coping methods, like humor, were in short supply. When I finally crawled into the tent, the forest around me seemed to exhale. 1 minute, everything was quiet, and the next, I'd swear I heard a faint rustling or a twig snapping underfoot. It was subtle enough that it could have been anything, an animal, a gust of wind, but my brain was already spinning tales of horror, imagining silent watchers waiting just outside. I spent half the night telling myself it was all in my head, but every time I drifted off, a fresh noise jolted me awake. By dawn, I felt as though I hadn't slept a wink, the shadows under my eyes a testament to my frayed nerves. Determined not to let fear ruin my trip, I tried to embrace a casual morning routine. I made coffee with my portable stove, soaking in the crisp air and the gorgeous palette of autumn leaves. The other campers seemed cheerful enough, waving good morning and chatting about their plans. A couple was heading into Salem to do a witch history tour, while another group planned on a scenic hike. I'd been hoping to do something similar, maybe photograph old gravestones or visit a local museum. But that undercurrent of tension hadn't gone away. If anything, it felt stronger with the sun up, like the forest was warning me that daylight didn't necessarily mean safety. After breakfast, I headed into town for some supplies and a bit of exploration. Salem's streets bustled with tourists, especially around the famous witch trial hotspots. But behind the costumed tour guides and souvenir shops, there was a layer of seriousness I couldn't ignore. At a local cafe, I overheard a couple of employees talking in hushed tones about things happening near the outskirts, but they clammed up the second they noticed me listening. It was unsettling, like everyone sort of knew a piece of the puzzle but didn't dare piece it together in public. On my way back to the campground, I took a winding side road that my phone's GPS insisted was a shortcut. The paved road gave way to gravel, and soon I was surrounded by thick trees that arched overhead, blotting out most of the midday light. A heavy feeling settled in my chest, something close to dread. I noticed a few battered signs warning about private property, but they seemed to have been there for decades. Something about that route felt older than old, like I was crossing through a gateway to a part of Salem where time had warped and lost meaning. When I arrived back at camp, I found my tent slightly askew, pegs loosened, flap unzipped. At first, I thought maybe a curious raccoon had rummaged around, but I noticed footprints in the damp soil, footprints that didn't match my own shoe size. My heart thumped against my ribcage. Could another camper have messed with my stuff? It didn't make sense. Nothing was missing and nothing was trashed, but my tent was definitely disturbed. Leaning down, I spotted something etched into one of the tent pegs, a small symbol that looked like two overlapping circles. I had no clue what it meant, but it left a disturbing weight in my gut, like I'd just been singled out for something unknown. That night, I decided to stay up later around the fire, reasoning that if someone or something was prowling around my camp, I'd rather catch them in the act than wake up to more unsettling surprises. Hours passed without incident. The logs crackled, sending sparks into the night sky, and my mind began to wander. I wondered if the weird energy I felt was just me psyching myself out, or if Salem really carried a hidden dimension that fed off the ghost stories swirling around it. The more I sat there, the more I realized how mesmerizing the flicker of flames could be, how they seemed to dance in time with the quiet pulse of the forest. Sometime after midnight, I sensed movement at the corner of my vision. When I turned, I thought I saw a pale face watching from behind a tree, but it vanished so quickly I could have imagined it. My pulse kicked up, and I stood, calling out a shaky hello. No response, just the silent woods, stoic as always, and a slight breeze that ruffled the branches overhead. As the adrenaline drained, my rational mind tried to explain it away. Maybe a trick of the light or the reflection of the moon on an odd shape in the bark. But deep down, I knew I wasn't imagining all of it. I eventually crawled into my sleeping bag, determined to rest, but feeling a prickle of dread with every little noise. That night, I dreamed of crooked paths twisting through endless trees, branches grasping at me like hands. I dreamed of footsteps echoing behind me, always just far enough that I couldn't see who, or what, was following. And most unsettling of all, I dreamed of that symbol carved on my tent peg, glowing in the darkness as though it were alive. By morning, I woke up drenched in sweat, the uneasy memory of the dream clinging to me like a film I couldn't wash off. Although I was rattled, I resolved not to let fear dictate my next steps. I've faced tough situations back in Florida, emergencies that test your courage and your nerves. I figured I could handle a few strange happenings in a place known for its creepy folklore, but my gut told me there was more to this than local rumors. With each passing hour, I felt like I was tiptoeing closer to the heart of Salem's secrets, the ones people rarely mention in the tourist brochures. The real question, though, was whether I'd be able to handle what I found when those secrets finally revealed themselves. Little did I know, the problems were only just beginning, and the decisions I'd soon face would put me on a collision course with a threat I never imagined. Sure, I'd signed up for a good scare in the name of fun and exploration, but Salem had other plans that would test the limits of my sanity and push me to the very edge of reason. And even if I wanted to escape, I wasn't sure it would let me go so easily. I tried telling myself it was just a rough first night, that lots of campers get jittery when they're on unfamiliar ground. But something about Salem wouldn't let me breathe easy. After that strange encounter with the footprints and the symbol etched into my tent peg, I realized I'd either have to double down on exploring this place or pack up and call it quits. Given my stubborn streak, leaving without answers wasn't an option. That morning, I brewed some coffee and watched as the sun filtered through the autumn leaves, painting the campsite in a soft gold that clashed with the uneasy vibe in my gut. I'd come here to escape my own stresses, but it felt like I'd stepped into an even bigger pile of anxiety. I wasn't the only one unsettled by the place. While I sipped my coffee, I overheard hushed talk from a nearby couple who'd arrived the night before. They sounded spooked, discussing weird chanting they claimed to have heard around 3 in the morning. The woman insisted she'd seen a flicker of light in the woods, like a lantern swaying between the trees. Her partner tried to brush it off as a trick of the moonlight, but the tension in his voice was unmistakable. When they realized I was listening, they clammed up, offering only forced smiles. If they'd heard chanting and seen lights, then maybe I wasn't the only one Salem had decided to mess with. Determined to push forward, I drove into downtown Salem again, thinking some touristy ghost tours or museums might give me background on what I was experiencing. I ended up at a modest little museum off a side street, not nearly as crowded as the bigger attractions. The exhibits mostly covered the historical side of the witch trials, old court documents, dusty letters, and paintings that showed a community gripped by paranoia. Yet as I lingered by a glass case filled with odd artifacts, a middle-aged docent approached me. She wore a name tag reading Margaret, and though her eyes crinkled kindly when she smiled, I sensed a deeper worry beneath. We got to chatting, and I hinted that I was camping outside town, near a stretch of woods people seemed wary of. Her expression shifted. Her jaw tightened just enough for me to notice. She explained that many locals consider those outskirts risky territory, a place that's steeped in older beliefs not everyone wants to talk about. She didn't outright confirm any modern witchcraft or bizarre rituals, but her polite deflections told me there was more going on than she cared to say. At one point, she lowered her voice and muttered, "Sometimes the land doesn't forget. It just waits." Then she quickly excused herself to lead a tour group, leaving me with my pulse ticking faster and more questions bubbling up in my mind. I spent the rest of the morning poking around the quieter streets of Salem, hoping to stumble on someone else willing to share local legends. But most shops sold the same witch-themed trinkets and t-shirts, capitalizing on the city's notorious past without addressing anything truly disturbing. A few times, I tried bringing up the campsite weirdness in casual conversation, but the responses ranged from playful curiosity, "Ooh, maybe it's real witches," to awkward deflections, "It's just raccoons, honey." None of it felt genuine or helpful. I was starting to think I needed a different approach, maybe something more direct. Back at camp that afternoon, I found my tent still intact, thank goodness, but I noticed a series of fresh marks on the nearby trees. They looked almost like slashes, spaced evenly along the bark. I pressed my fingertips to the grooves, half expecting them to feel warm or give off some weird energy, but they were just ordinary cuts in the wood. Still, the uniformity of these slashes made no sense to me. It was too neat, like someone had methodically scored the bark in straight lines for a purpose I couldn't guess. Looking around, I realized they formed a rough triangle around my site, all within a few yards of where I slept. To shake off the nerves, I took a short hike to see if the rest of the forest looked normal. For the most part, it did, just dense pines and oaks, leaf-strewn trails, and the occasional rustle of wildlife. But I couldn't get past the sensation that I was being watched. It wasn't paranoia in the usual sense. It felt like the woods themselves were paying attention, stretching their roots toward me in silent interest. Once, I caught a glimpse of movement between the branches and nearly jumped out of my skin. Yet when I crept closer, there was nothing there, not even a squirrel darting away. The emptiness of it all only fed my apprehension. Sunset came earlier than I expected. One minute it was late afternoon, the light slanting through the trees, and the next, a deep gold was bleeding into purple dusk. That sense of the forest observing me only amplified as the shadows lengthened, especially near the area where I'd first pitched my tent. Every whisper of wind through the branches seemed like a cautionary hiss. Get out while you still can. But I'd come this far, and I had a stubborn streak about finishing what I started, even if I wasn't quite sure what I was starting exactly. So, I rebuilt my campfire, tossing in extra wood to keep it roaring, hoping the blaze would chase off the gloom. As darkness fell, I realized the campsite was emptier than before. The couple who'd mentioned chanting was gone, and a few others seemed to have left, too. I didn't see them pack up, and their absence gave the place a lonely, almost abandoned air. The caretaker's RV near the entrance was locked up tight, lights off, like no one was home. For a moment, I considered calling a friend, just to have a normal conversation that might ground me. But my phone's reception was patchy, and the battery was inexplicably draining faster than usual. I found myself holding it up, trying to catch a bar of signal, and wondering if this was how people in old horror stories felt before their luck ran out. When the fire settled into steady coals, I decided to walk a small loop around my site, shining my flashlight on the forest floor for any sign of footprints or weird symbols. The crunch of leaves under my boots sounded disproportionately loud, and my breath fogged in the cool air. At one point, my beam caught on something shiny, a piece of metal half buried in the dirt. Kneeling down, I brushed away leaves and discovered it was a weathered pendant shaped like a crescent moon, carved with swirling designs. It looked handmade, old. I glanced around, wondering if someone had dropped it by accident or if it had been placed there intentionally. Something about its presence struck me as a deliberate clue, left where I couldn't miss it. Bringing it closer to my face, I saw faint scrawls on the surface, maybe initials or runes too worn to decipher. Either way, it radiated a strange aura that made my fingers tingle. I tucked it into my pocket, and as I did, a gust of wind tore through the clearing, blowing sparks from the fire skyward. In that second, I could have sworn I heard a soft voice carried on the wind, whispering my name. My throat tightened, adrenaline spiking. Shining my flashlight wildly around, I caught nothing but dancing shadows. The forest was mocking me, or maybe warning me, and every instinct told me I was tiptoeing into dangerous territory. Back at the fire, I mulled over that pendant, turning it over in my hands. It felt like a puzzle piece I didn't know how to place, connected somehow to the footprints, the slash marks, and the tension humming in the air. Could it belong to someone who practiced some kind of ritual out here? Was Salem more than just a historical footnote with touristy ghost tours? With each new oddity I uncovered, I started to believe that these stories of modern covens, hidden gatherings, or leftover energies from the witch trial era might be more than just folklore. Part of me wanted to pack my bags and flee, but another part, a bigger one, was transfixed by the mystery. I decided to keep watch again that night, though exhaustion pulled at me like quicksand. Around midnight, the wind died entirely, leaving the forest in a hush so total it hurt my ears. The coals in the fire glowed a deep orange, casting a flickering circle of light. That's when I heard it, a low hum, almost like singing, drifting from somewhere deep in the pines. My skin prickled. This was no random rustling, no misguided tourist. It was slow, rhythmic, and had a strange cadence that made my scalp tingle. Standing up, I grabbed my flashlight, every nerve in my body buzzing with caution. Following the sound felt both insane and inevitable. Each step toward the edge of my campsite was agonizing, my muscles taut with fear. The hum grew louder, weaving itself into a kind of chanting that pulsed with an otherworldly energy. Soon, I saw a faint glow, a pale light shifting among the trees. My heart hammered so hard I could barely breathe. Yet I couldn't turn back, caught in the spell of this scary phenomenon that teased me onward. The chanting peaked, a layer of voices overlapping in a mesmerizing wave, until it suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the chanting. My flashlight beam wavered across twisted trunks, revealing nothing but my own ragged breath echoing in my ears. Had I stumbled onto some secret ritual? Or had I scared them away? The hair on my arm stood up as I realized I wasn't alone. A presence lingered in the hush, something big and ancient and brimming with quiet menace. Even the ground felt charged, like an electrical current vibrating under my feet. When I finally found the courage to speak, my voice cracked. "Who's there?" No answer, just an overwhelming sense of being watched. The moment stretched, my flashlight illuminating empty space, while the darkness beyond pressed closer. Something compelled me to look down, and I saw fresh footprints in the dirt, bare, human, veering off into the trees. Biting back a surge of panic, I followed them a few steps before I noticed they formed a circle, looping around the trunk of a massive oak and back to the spot where I stood, as if whoever made them had been pacing around me from the start. My blood ran cold. I backed away, stumbling over a root, dropping my flashlight in the process. The beam spun wildly, revealing a flicker of white cloth disappearing behind a nearby tree. Scrambling for my flashlight, I caught it just before it rolled into a small ditch. By the time I aimed it back at the tree, the cloth, or whoever wore it, was gone. In that final moment of absolute terror, I realized I was shaking uncontrollably, heart pounding like it might burst. Salem wasn't just a backdrop for ghost stories. It was a living stage, and I was part of a script I didn't understand. My campsite didn't feel like a refuge anymore, but the only place I could run back to. That night, I barely slept, haunted by questions too disturbing to ignore. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than me, and it was tightening its grip with each passing hour. I lay awake, dread wrapping around me like a blanket, waiting for the next shoe to drop. I woke up to a sky stained with gray clouds, and a chill in the air that went deeper than the temperature. My muscles felt leaden from the tense night before. Every rustle outside my tent set my pulse racing, and I hated how jumpy I'd become. It reminded me of what it's like when I have back-to-back emergencies at work. No time to recover, just a constant barrage on my nerves. Except here in Salem, there was no blueprint for what I was facing. There were no guidelines, no protocols, just an unsettling maze of questions without answers. I decided the best way to handle it was to confront things head-on. If someone, or something, was skulking around my campsite at night, I wanted a clearer view of who they were and why they were messing with me. So I spent part of the morning rigging a simple perimeter alarm, a few tin cans tied with fishing line around the outer edge of my site. It wasn't high-tech, but at least if anything moved through the area, I'd hear it. Part of me felt a little silly, but fear will push you to do all sorts of things you'd never considered. Once I'd finished, I realized I was procrastinating on investigating the weirder aspects of my situation. That pendant I found, for instance, why hadn't I done more to figure out what those symbols meant? Sitting by my half-dead phone, I used the last bit of battery to snap a couple of clear photos of the crescent moon design, hoping to check a local library or talk to a knowledgeable shop owner in town. Somehow, I felt that if I could decode it, I might get a grip on the disturbing undercurrent swirling around me. When I arrived at Salem's modest library, the librarian on duty, Miss Palmer, seemed intrigued by my request to identify old symbols. She examined the photos with a thoughtful frown, then flipped through a few hefty tomes on local folklore. Although she couldn't find an exact match, she pointed me to a dusty chapter about isolated sects that supposedly operated in the Salem area during the 18th century. It mentioned cryptic moon iconography and references to night congregations in the woods, fragments of text that practically made my skin crawl. Ms. Palmer's tone dropped to a whisper when she said, "People like to forget Salem's hidden histories. Maybe some pages are best left unturned." The atmosphere in the library felt stifling after that, like the old wooden shelves were leaning in to eavesdrop on my conversation. I thanked Ms. Palmer and left, stepping into an afternoon that had turned oddly gray, the sun choked by heavy clouds. The air carried a dampness that hinted at an incoming storm, and the wind gusting down the street made the witch-themed flags flap noisily. Every so often, I'd catch glimpses of people giving me strange looks, as though they sensed I wasn't just another curious visitor snapping photos for social media. On a whim, I ducked into an antique shop near the end of a narrow alleyway. The cramped interior smelled of dust and old leather, and the shelves brimmed with oddities, tarnished mirrors, moth-eaten tapestries, even rusted lanterns that might have once lit these ancient streets. An elderly man behind the counter asked what I was searching for. I described the pendant, half expecting him to laugh or brush me off. Instead, he grew solemn, mentioning a local legend about forest watchers, figures rumored to guard sacred sites on Salem's outskirts, sites travelers were never meant to see. He insisted I be careful, that some parts of history prefer to remain in the shadows. By the time I got back to camp, the clouds had thickened into a slate-gray ceiling. My tent stood where I'd left it, the tin can perimeter untouched. Yet I couldn't relax, not with everything I'd learned swirling in my head. The notion of forest watchers made the hairs on my neck prickle, bringing back memories of those footprints looping around the trunk and the fleeting glimpses of cloth vanishing behind trees. I kind of wished for the company of another camper, if only to confirm I wasn't losing it. But the grounds were strangely empty now, as if I'd scared everyone off just by being here. A gust of wind barreled through, snapping branches overhead and sending a flurry of leaves spiraling. The storm was imminent, the sky tinted with that eerie greenish hue you sometimes see before rain. With shaky hands, I secured my tent's rainfly and double-checked my perimeter alarm. I couldn't help but feel like an animal bedding down before a predator's approach. My mind replayed Ms. Palmer's cautious whisper and the antique shop owner's dire warning. This wasn't just local lore for the tourists. Whatever was stirring in these woods had a lineage, a legacy that traced back through Salem's darkest years. I holed up in my truck, waiting for the storm to break, and tried to steal my nerves. Rain started tapping the roof like impatient fingers, and each roll of thunder seemed to rattle my composure. My phone was dead, so there'd be no calling for help if something went wrong. As the light outside waned and my reflection in the window grew sharper, I thought about the bare footprints, the moon pendant, the chanting that had teased my curiosity. I hadn't just stumbled into Salem's secrets. I'd forced my way in, and now the forest watchers, or whoever they were, seemed intent on making sure I faced whatever dark truths lay in these haunted woods. I holed up in my truck for the better part of an hour, listening to the rain pound the roof in waves that made my heart skip. Lightning flashed beyond the tree line, illuminating the campsite for seconds at a time. I'd flick my gaze to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, or something, lurking in the glow. Each thunderclap rattled my nerves, and I couldn't decide if I felt safer in the truck or more like a sitting duck. At least in here, I had a barrier between me and the downpour, but the sense of being cornered only grew. With my phone dead and the storm raging, I knew I couldn't count on immediate backup if everything went south. Eventually, the lightning diminished to a distant flicker, and the rain softened into a steady hiss. The tension in my neck loosened just enough for me to consider grabbing a few hours of rest in the passenger seat. But as I closed my eyes, an odd glow through the windshield caught my attention, something flickering at the far edge of the clearing. My first instinct was to freeze, pulse hammering in my ears. Could it be a reflection, maybe the last remnants of lightning? But the glow persisted, throbbing like a heartbeat. Against all better judgment, I clicked on my flashlight and stepped out into the drizzle. The wet earth sucked at my boots, each step squelching as I made my way around the truck. My makeshift tin can alarm still hung undisturbed, swaying in the light wind. Yet, that pale glow remained, beckoning me toward a cluster of trees I hadn't explored before. The temperature seemed to drop with each step, like I was walking into a natural refrigerator. I called out, voice shaky, "Hello? Anyone out there?" Thunder rumbled weakly overhead, but no human voice answered. Still, the glow pulsed in the darkness, pulling me further from the relative safety of my campsite. A growing dread coiled in my gut, but curiosity tugged me forward. I followed the glow until I reached a small clearing I'd never noticed on my previous hikes. In the center stood a stone pillar, waist-high, with strange grooves and carvings that ran down its sides. A pale light glimmered at its top, but when I got closer, I realized it wasn't fire or a lantern. It was some kind of phosphorescent substance, possibly a fungus clinging to the rock. Yet, the patterns along the pillar's surface were unmistakable, symbols reminiscent of the ones on the pendant and the slash marks around my camp. Despite the cold rain still drizzling on my jacket, sweat beaded on my forehead. My mind churned with questions. Was this some piece of old Salem history? A marker for the so-called forest watchers? Just then, a snap of a branch behind me made me whirl around, hard in my throat. My flashlight beam fell on a figure stepping out from behind a thick oak. They wore a waterlogged coat, hood pulled up, face partially obscured in shadow. My mind leapt to every horror scenario I'd conjured over the last few days, yet the person raised a hand in a peaceful gesture. "You shouldn't be here," they said, voice muffled by the rain and the hood's fabric. Lightning flashed overhead, and I caught a glimpse of furrowed brows, eyes that seemed more worried than hostile. Despite every instinct telling me to run, I found myself rooted to the spot, drawn in by the quiet intensity of their gaze. "Who are you?" I managed, my voice trembling. The figure hesitated, glancing at the pillar and then back at me, as if weighing how much to reveal. "Call me Rowan," they replied, stepping closer so I could see the outlines of a serious expression. "Whatever you think is happening here, it's worse. You're stepping on ground people have feared for centuries." My stomach tightened. The air crackled with tension, almost as if the woods themselves leaned in to listen. I shot a glance at the pillar, its symbols glowing faintly in the gloom. "What do you know about this?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice even. Rowan sighed, removing the hood to reveal hair plastered to their forehead by the rain. "I know too much," they said quietly, eyes flickering to the swirling designs on the stone. "Locals sometimes call it a watch post, but it's more like a warning. Back in the 1700s, a sect performed rituals around these markers, believing they were gateways to something older than the witch trials. When the trials ended, the sect didn't. They just went underground, passing secrets down through generations. The Watchers are their descendants, if you can even call them that. Thunder boomed again, and I felt cold dread seep into my bones. I swallowed hard, a dozen questions tangling in my mind. Why haven't the authorities done something? I demanded, though I already suspected the answer. Rowan shook their head grimly. Some tried, but it never ends well. The Watchers don't just perform ceremonies. They protect these sites from prying eyes. People vanish, or they come back, changed. My breath caught. Memories of footprints, chanting, and stolen glimpses of robed figures rushed back, melding with the reality of this moment. A swirl of panic and anger swept through me. So what am I supposed to do? Pack up and leave, hoping this all just fades away. Rowan's gaze softened, betraying genuine concern. If you stay, they won't stop. They see your presence as a threat, or maybe an offering. I'm sorry, truly. My mind reeled at the word offering, as if that clarified the eerie, almost predatory vibe I'd been feeling. Another flash of lightning illuminated Rowan's face, revealing a scar running down one temple. You got out once, didn't you? I blurted. Their eyes dropped. I got lucky, they admitted. But luck's in short supply out here. You have to decide now. Get out or prepare for a fight you can't win. In that charged silence, the pillar's glow dimmed, as though losing interest in our presence. Rain dripped from the branches overhead, tapping out a slow, relentless rhythm. My entire body shivered, partly from the cold, partly from the weight of the decision. Was it even my decision? Salem's shadows felt alive, coiling tighter around me with every breath. I glanced back at Rowan, searching for some trace of hope in their eyes, but found only a grim resignation. My stomach twisted. Something told me that no matter how I chose, Salem's Watchers wouldn't just let me slip away. They hadn't gone to all this trouble for nothing. Rowan led me back toward my campsite under the fading storm clouds, each of us glancing over our shoulder with every crunch of wet leaves. Our conversation still rattled in my head. Watchers, ancient gateways, secrets passed down through centuries. My heart felt like it was lodged in my throat, and even the rain-soaked ground seemed to radiate tension, as if the land itself braced for what was coming next. When we finally reached the clearing, I spotted my truck sitting there in the muddy soil, the tin cans around my perimeter clinking softly in the breeze. It felt surreal seeing such a normal object amid a place that had become a living horror story. Even stepping within my little camp didn't ease the dread that coiled under my skin. Rowan's gaze flickered around the area like they were expecting an ambush. You need to go, they repeated, voice urgent. But I couldn't peel my eyes away from the massive oaks swaying along the edge of the clearing, their silhouettes dark against the still threatening sky. My brain fired off warnings, memories of chanting, footprints that looped around trunks, glimpses of white cloth disappearing behind branches. I tried leaving. I muttered, recalling the feeling of being pulled back every time I contemplated fleeing Salem. An ache throbbed behind my temples, part stress, part sleep deprivation. Rowan's eyes locked on mine. Staying is worse, they insisted, but their tone held a note of resignation. They knew as well as I did that this wasn't just my choice anymore. A distant rumble of thunder echoed in the sky, and an unsettling hush fell over the clearing. I glanced at the tree line, half expecting robed figures to step out at any second. My gut churned. Tell me what they want, I said, voice cracking. Rowan hesitated, jaw tight. Sometimes it's just to scare people off, they said quietly. Other times, they need someone to serve as a conduit for their rights. A sacrifice, in a sense. My limbs went cold. I thought of the footprints around my tent, the chanting at night, the slash marks forming a triangle near my sight. All of it felt like puzzle pieces snapping into place. The Watchers weren't just protecting their secrets. They were grooming me for something darker. Lightning forked overhead, lighting up the clearing. For a split second, I thought I saw a shadow flicker behind one of the pines, a shape that disappeared the moment my eyes tried to focus on it. My throat went dry. This wasn't abstract anymore. The Watchers were here, or close enough to see us, maybe even circling. Rowan tugged on my arm. We have to move. They rarely strike in broad daylight, but dusk is coming fast, and the storm's only buying us a little time. Shoving down a surge of panic, I scrambled to gather what remained of my gear. My hands shook so badly that I nearly fumbled the tent stakes. I could feel the watchers in every gust of wind, in every shifting branch, as if the forest itself was part of their brood. We loaded my essentials into the truck bed, each of us flinching at the faintest noise. A twig snapped somewhere, setting my nerves on fire. Rowan and I exchanged a look, a silent acknowledgement that we might be out of our depth. I climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key, praying this wasn't some cosmic joke. The engine coughed, sputtered, then roared to life. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. As I peeled away from the campsite, the truck's headlights cut across the trees, revealing a cluster of tall silhouettes perched at the edge of the woods. They wore something akin to cloaks or long coats, their faces invisible in the gloom. My stomach lurched. One figure raised a hand, almost in farewell, as we sped onto the muddy back road. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, but Rowan stayed eerily calm, scanning the roadside as we navigated ruts and puddles. The storm had drenched everything, turning dirt into a slick mess, and the truck fishtailed at every sharp turn. "You know a way out?" I asked, voice tight. Rowan shook their head. "We can try the main highway, but the watchers have been known to block roads, fallen trees, strange debris. They've had a lot of practice." My thoughts scattered, images of barricades and detours twisting through the forest. Every corner felt like a trap waiting to snap shut. I thought about the times I tried to leave Salem already, only to be lured back by footprints or chanting. The watchers weren't letting me go without a fight. We reached a fork in the road. One path led towards Salem proper, the other supposedly wound toward a bigger highway. Rowan insisted we take the highway route, so I spun the wheel, tires churning up mud. Bare branches arched overhead like ribs in a giant beast, swallowing the truck in darkness. My headlights washed over a set of freshly downed logs, forcing me to slam the brakes. The engine sputtered angrily as I nearly skidded into the debris. Heart hammering, I reversed, but something caught my eye, faint candlelight glimmering through the trees. A line of robed watchers stood off to the side, their figures lit by tiny flames. They weren't blocking the road by accident. They were hurting us. Rowan gripped my shoulder. "Go back," they hissed, but it was too late. A cluster of watchers stepped onto the path behind us, their silhouettes swaying like reeds in the wind. Panic burst in my chest. The chanting began, soft, rhythmic, more terrifying than any scream. Shadows flickered across their cloaked forms, the candlelight making them seem inhumanly tall. The chanting echoed in my head, dredging up every horrific possibility I'd imagined since first setting foot in these woods. My vision blurred with fear. All I remember is Rowan shouting, "We'll find another way," as I stamped on the gas. Mud sprayed, the truck lurched, and the chanting soared to a fever pitch. In that final, frantic moment, the watchers closed in, merging with the night itself. And in a flash of lightning, I realized there might be no way out of Salem's clutches. No escape from the age-old terror that claimed all who dared trespass on its hidden rights.